Question. Just to be clear, since you were 22 or 23 years old to the present date, your primary way of making money was to be employed by people who claim to be associated with government intelligence? Answer. That's correct. Question. You mentioned that in 2004 you had personal income of over $10 million. Did you file any tax return for that money? Answer. No. Question. Did you intentionally not file a tax return for that money? Answer. That's correct. Question. Did you pay taxes for that money? Answer. I pay taxes when I'm told to pay taxes, and I've been told not to do anything concerning anything of my involvements unless I'm instructed to. Question. Who told you not to pay? Answer. I've been told by various people. You want their names? Question. Yes. Answer. Francis Driscoll. Question. Just to be clear, what did he tell you about paying taxes? Answer. He told me I was involved in projects that were sensitive, of an extremely sensitive nature. He said he didn't want these projects, nor any of the electronics, engineering, or any part of them ever reaching the public, and I would never be bothered, and to proceed with my life, and do not file. And I asked repeatedly, what should I do about this? You pay me, what do I do? You will never be bothered by the United States government. You keep what you do private, and never let this reach the United States. Never let the things you're involved in reach the public. They are national security matters. That's what he told me. Question. By never be bothered, you mean never be asked to pay your personal income taxes? Answer. Never be bothered in any way by the United States government. You will never be bothered. Obviously, that's not the case, is it? That was an abridged excerpt from Robert Booth Nichols' 2008 deposition in the Sam Israel Ponzi scheme case. Nichols had just been caught stealing $10 million from the head of a Wall Street hedge fund, and yet here he was, sitting across the table from the Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, openly admitting that he'd neglected to pay taxes on millions of dollars in income over the preceding 4 decades. The government's official position in the case was that Robert Booth Nichols was just a con man who pretended to have intelligence connections so he could defraud people like the hedge fund owner Sam Israel out of millions of dollars. But the government's actions in the case told a different story. If Robert Booth Nichols was just a con man, why were his name, his depositions, and his supposedly fake intelligence connections placed under seal by the U.S. government? Why did they redact portions of the case materials before they were released to the public? And if they had Nichols under oath admitting he hadn't paid taxes for 4 decades, why didn't they criminally indict him for tax evasion? Or for stealing that $10 million? These questions, like many others in this case, point to one conclusion. Robert Booth Nichols was above the law, or outside of it. At every turn, Nichols seemed to be protected from above, with investigations into his actions quashed and his crimes ignored, with powerful actors always ready to intercede on his behalf behind the scenes. Nichols was at the very center of what Danny Casolaro called the Octopus, a network of corrupt players from the intelligence world, organized crime, and the military-industrial complex, who had conspired with those at the very pinnacle of American political power to create a shadow government run entirely off the black budget, enriching its members in the process. According to Nichols' close friends, he was a contractor for the National Security Council. According to some senior military officers, he was a mythical figure in the world of black ops. According to Nichols himself, he was an intelligence subcontractor who'd worked for the CIA in over 30 countries, from Central America to Southeast Asia. And according to the public-facing institutions of the American government, he was a money launderer and a con man, with connections to the Gambino crime family and the Reagan White House. So who was telling the truth about Robert Booth Nichols? And what if they all were? So the Octopus case, as defined by the journalist Danny Casolaro, is notorious for its complexity and the seemingly infinite number of rabbit holes that branch off from it. So including an introduction to the Octopus case itself would make this video overlong and needlessly complicated. If you're not familiar with the Octopus case, or you need a refresher, I would strongly suggest watching the Netflix series American Conspiracy, or at least the Unsolved Mysteries segment on the case, before watching this video, because this video contains references to figures and events from the case which won't make sense without that context. I'll leave links to both in the description. What the octopus represents, however, is really the story of the American national security state in the second half of the 20th century. The Church and Pike committees of the 1970s had revealed the outrageous abuses committed by the CIA in the preceding decades, from Operation Mockingbird and Chaos to MKUltra and the Family Jewels. The ensuing scandals produced two important effects. First, much of the agency's old guard was pushed out in a series of CIA house cleanings in the wake of the scandals. But these men didn't just disappear or retire. Instead, they created a whole new class of highly trained gray market operators, skilled in the arts of money laundering, gun running, and special operations, with lists of highly placed contacts in government and industry all over the world. After being pushed out of the agency, these men needed somewhere to ply their trade. And that's where the second part comes in. Rather than being CIA employees, bound by CIA budgets and regulations, these gray market operators set up subcontracting firms to take on the jobs the American intelligence apparatus considered too dirty for its own hands. The new setup was a win-win. The CIA got to channel some of its more nefarious projects through black-budget front companies and private subcontractors, providing a new layer of plausible deniability for the agency. And the disgraced good old boys club of the Operation Chaos-era CIA got to maintain their power and influence while becoming filthy rich in the process. For all its complexity, the Octopus case is, at its core, the story of this secret partnership between the American government and the new, clandestine arm of the military-industrial complex it was building in the shadows. Ultimately, Robert Booth Nichols was just one small part of this transformation, but his case represents in microcosm the corruption and lawlessness which the octopus came to embody. Frustratingly little is known about Nichols' early life, but a 1982 FBI report states that Nichols was born to a wealthy Los Angeles surgeon in Loma Linda, California in 1943. He attended Hollywood Professional School, a private school which catered to children who were already working in the entertainment industry. The same FBI report states that Nichols ran away from home at age 17. Nichols himself testified that he spent a short stint at Glendale Junior College in California. Either way, sources agree that by the early 60s, he ended up in Hawaii. Nichols appears to have gotten his first introduction to the world of organized crime a few years later in Honolulu, when an alleged overseas Yakuza boss named Harold Okamoto took Nichols under his wing. On paper, Nichols became the vice president of Okamoto's home security system company in 1968, working in Honolulu, and then for a Glendale, California construction company. In reality, Okamoto appears to have been running gambling and drug operations throughout the Pacific, with Nichols conducting business on his behalf in Japan, Australia, and Hawaii. By his own telling, Nichols' involvement in the intelligence world began at roughly the same time, in the mid-1960s. According to Nichols, he was at the Waikiki Surfrider Hotel when a man calling himself Ken offered him $50 to approach a specific woman at the hotel bar and find out what she was doing in Hawaii. When the ploy was successful, Ken revealed that he was with the CIA and began recruiting Nichols for other information-gathering operations in Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Mexico, Japan, India, Norway, and France. Across different tellings from separate sources, the characters of Ken and Harold Okamoto sometimes blend together. Occasionally, Nichols will attribute to Ken and his CIA contacts something which is elsewhere attributed to Okamoto. On its own, this isn't enough to say that Nichols used Ken as a codename for Okamoto, but it's worth noting that there are reports that Harold Okamoto was himself associated with American intelligence, and had at some point worked under the auspices of former Deputy CIA Director Frank Carlucci. By 1971, the FBI was investigating Nichols over his business dealings in Australia, and a 1978 FBI report described Nichols as a professional con man who had some unknown association with intelligence agencies. According to the report, Nichols was by this time an international money launderer and arms dealer with organized crime connections, who was, quote, associated with the illegal transportation of narcotics through the Golden Triangle, and had done business with Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, among other notable foreign government figures. The FBI said Nichols told others in his circle that he'd been sent to Switzerland for 3 years to be taught the secrets of high finance for intelligence agencies. According to Nichols, he had learned how the CIA and NSA funded their operations through black-budget Swiss bank accounts. Despite having no apparent source of income, Nichols was by this time living in Los Angeles 3 months a year, while the other 9 months were spent traveling or living in a $3.5 million villa in Italy. A Department of Justice prosecutor would later admit to the journalist Danny Casolaro that he'd found evidence indicating that Nichols had offered to become a confidential informant for the DOJ in the late 1970s. This detail is especially strange. Typically, criminals don't spontaneously volunteer to become informants for the federal government, but rather they're forced into informant work as a last resort when it's the only way to get out of their own criminal charges. The DOJ prosecutor, Richard Stavin, said that he'd asked around, and every department in the DOJ denied ever having used Nichols as an informant, but Stavin wasn't convinced, describing it as a cover-your-ass situation. That March 1978 FBI report was from an investigation the Bureau had opened into Nichols for drug smuggling, money laundering, and related activities. By 1981, a background investigation into Nichols had indicated that he'd spent the last 10 years as an international financial consultant with numerous government contacts throughout the world. This era of Nichols' life, his rise from a CIA asset honey-trapping foreign women in Honolulu to an international money launderer with contacts at the highest levels of governments the world over, is the most sparsely documented part of the timeline, a black box from which little information has escaped. But Robert Booth Nichols' life was about to intersect with the apex of organized crime, black-budget intelligence operations, and the military-industrial complex in the intricate web of covert actors and conspiracies which has come to be known as the Octopus. According to Sherry Seymour's book, The Last Circle, Nichols had known the troubled scientific genius Michael Riconosciuto since at least the late 60s. But in 1981, the two would partner with a retired arms manufacturer named Peter Zakowski to form a corporation they called Meridian Arms. As Meridian Arms, the three would consult on a joint venture between the Wackenhut Corporation and the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians Reservation, aimed at developing next-generation weapons with military applications. And at this point, we need to zoom out a little bit so we can consider these events in context. First, the partners. The Wackenhut Corporation was a private security contractor incorporated by a group of former FBI agents in 1954. The company got its start winning contracts to provide security for government installations like Cape Canaveral and the Nevada nuclear test site, but quickly expanded into private investigations and espionage. By 1965, the right-wing, anti-communist namesake of the company, George Wackenhut, had built a private database of files on some 2.5 million Americans. That was 1 in every 46 American adults at the time, who Wackenhut suspected of left-wing sympathies, and interested parties like the FBI or local police could purchase access to the database for a fee. By the late 1980s, Wackenhut was among the largest private investigation and security firms in the world, with offices throughout the U.S. and dozens of other countries. Wackenhut's single biggest customer since its founding was the United States government, and by the time of the joint venture with Nichols, it had become more or less a privatized arm of the national security state. Its board of directors featured a rotating cast of former CIA and FBI directors, defense secretaries, and top military brass. Wackenhut's government security contracts were awarded in a secret no-bid process, and it was an open secret in the security industry that these contracts were a way of compensating the company for the off-the-books clandestine work it performed for the CIA. According to William Corbett, a terrorism expert who spent 18 years as a CIA analyst, for years, Wackenhut has been involved with the CIA and other intelligence organizations, including the DEA. Wackenhut would allow the CIA to occupy positions within the company in order to carry out clandestine operations. He also said that Wackenhut would supply intelligence agencies with information and that it was compensated for this in a quid pro quo arrangement, Corbett says, with government contracts worth billions of dollars over the years. A few years after the joint venture with Nichols, Wackenhut had been caught illegally selling chemical weapons precursors and technology for weapons delivery systems to Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, allegedly at the direction of the CIA. Wackenhut was also suspected of illegally providing arms to the Contra army in Nicaragua during the events of Iran-Contra, something which Reagan's national security apparatus was later confirmed to have done during the same period. In this sense, Wackenhut became something like a domestic CIA front company. When the intelligence services wanted to accomplish an objective without any outside scrutiny or legal oversight, they would funnel black budget funds to Wackenhut and let the private corporation do the jobs that were too illegal, controversial, or politically sensitive for the government to do itself. The other party in the joint venture was a Native American tribe called the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians just outside Indio, California. A few years earlier, in the late 1970s, a brilliant former CIA agent named John Philip Nichols, no relation to Robert Booth Nichols, had assumed an executive role in the leadership of the reservation by promising to exploit tribal sovereignty law to generate new streams of income for its impoverished residents. Because of federal law and the treaties the American government had signed with certain tribes, Native American reservations operated under the principle of tribal sovereignty. The reservations and tribal lands were legally recognized by the U.S. government as essentially independent countries, which could make their own laws and choose not to enforce some state and federal laws within their own borders. John Philip Nichols was one of the first tribal managers in American history to begin building businesses on reservations which would be illegal anywhere else in the same state, like tax-free cigarette stores, bingo parlors, and eventually casinos. He ran the Cabazon Band reservation like a mafia operation, skimming money off the top for himself, intimidating tribe members who complained about how little of the profits the tribe was actually seeing, and even taking out contract hits on people who threatened to blow the whistle on his shady dealings. The joint venture between the tribe, Wackenhut, and Robert Booth Nichols' company, Meridian Arms, was yet another of these gray market, money-making operations being run from the reservation. Robert Booth Nichols already had experience in the arms manufacturing business. In the late 1970s, he'd incorporated Meridian Arms with the goal of developing a submachine gun with a simple design plan that could be produced for $50 or less per unit in developing countries. He obtained California state permits to possess and sell machine guns, using a CIA official named Larry Curran as one of his references on the application. According to Nichols' partner in the operation, the supposed scientific genius Michael Riconosciuto, the project was at least initially involved in developing and retrofitting weapons to supply to the Nicaraguan Contra army. And to understand this next part in context, we need to zoom out again. During the first Reagan administration in the early 1980s, one of the major foreign policy considerations facing the U.S. government was the civil war in Nicaragua between the left-wing Sandinista government and the right-wing counter-revolutionary militias, also known as the Contras. The Reagan administration considered overthrowing the legal government of Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, to be a priority, and to this end sought to channel funding, arms, and intelligence to the Contra militias. However, these efforts by Reagan's executive branch were limited by Congress, which, citing human rights abuses committed by the Contras, tried to limit the arms transfers, and eventually legally banned all government support to the Contras through legislation called the Boland Amendment. Senior officials of the Reagan administration, however, decided to ignore the law and sought other ways to arm the Contras which didn't require funding from Congress. One of the funding sources they soon settled on was illegally selling weapons to the Iranian government. At this time, Iran was engaged in a war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and the American government officially supported Iraq with funding, arms, training, and intelligence. After the Iran hostage crisis of the late 70s and early 80s, where American diplomats and other embassy personnel were taken hostage in Tehran, Washington had imposed an arms embargo on the Iranian government, refusing to sell them weapons and pressuring other countries to do the same. But to raise funds for the Contra Army, senior officials in the Reagan administration decided to allow black market arms sales to Iran, channeled through private sector and non-governmental actors allied with Washington. These private companies would then use some of the profits to supply weapons and funding to the Contras, maintaining the veil of secrecy over the government's involvement and enriching the corporations doing the gun running. This international arms trafficking operation, which would eventually become known as the Iran-Contra scandal, was coordinated at the highest levels of the American government by members of Ronald Reagan's National Security Council, or NSC. The NSC was originally an advisory body composed of senior executives from the military, intel agencies, and the president's cabinet, who got together to coordinate the government's actions on foreign policy. Since at least the Nixon administration, however, the NSC had been conducting its own covert intelligence and foreign policy operations, totally independent from congressional oversight and funding. To preserve a level of plausible deniability, the NSC would in turn delegate responsibility for many of these operations to the good old boy network of nominally independent private sector spies, which would eventually come to be known as the Octopus. Responsibility for conducting the actual weapons deals with the Contras fell to people like the retired Air Force officer and arms trafficker Richard Secord, along with Wackenhut and Robert Booth Nichols. And it turns out, in interviews with his friends and business associates from this period, Robert Booth Nichols was repeatedly described as a contractor for the National Security Council. Now, the role of contractor for the NSC wasn't like a job you could apply for. These people answered only to the president. The operations didn't officially exist, and there was no institutional infrastructure or personnel to draw from. These were essentially handshake deals conducted at the most secret, highly classified levels of government, where you basically just had to know a guy in the senior ranks of the military or intelligence apparatus to even be considered for the jobs. So the fact that the NSC turned to Robert Booth Nichols to conduct some of the very first international black market weapons deals of the Reagan administration suggests that Nichols was already a known quantity at the highest levels of the American government by the early 80s, someone whose senior military and intelligence figures knew could be trusted with their most politically sensitive and illegal projects. Unlike many elements of the Octopus case, the connection between Nichols and the Contras is easily verifiable. In September of 1981, just months after Ronald Reagan took office, the joint venture between Nichols and Wackenhut brought senior officials from the Contra Army to the Cabazon Reservation to watch weapons demonstrations as part of a sales pitch for the weapons being produced there. We know these demonstrations happened because local police actually surveilled a meeting at a firing range where Contra officials tested out guns and night vision scopes alongside representatives from the Wackenhut joint venture, the Cabazon tribe, the American military, and the CIA. According to the book The Last Circle by Sherry Seymour, a special operations report emanating from the Riverside, California District Attorney's Office, which was sent to John Cohen, investigator for the House Judiciary Committee on Inslaw, provided indisputable proof that Wackenhut sold arms to the Contras. The Special Operations Intelligence Report entitled Nicaraguans and Earl Bryan at Lake Coahuila, 9/10/81, described a meeting held between two groups, the Nicaraguans and the Wackenhut and Cabazon officials, at a county-owned police firing range at Lake Coahuila in Riverside County. According to the surveillance report, the purpose of the meeting was to test a new night vision device and weapons. All the weapons tested were semi-automatic. A new sniper rifle tested was a .50 caliber with a .308 bullet. The report went on to note that some automatic weapons were present, but all had necessary permits through Meridian Arms. Meridian Arms is owned by Michael Riconosciuto, Robert Booth Nichols, no relation to John Philip Nichols, and Don Oliver, former undersheriff of San Diego County. Meeting and testing took about 1 hour, then all parties left. Police officers had been placed around the surrounding area in a surveillance protection type mode. The license plate numbers of each car that arrived on the scene was included in the report, along with the names and identification of everyone who attended the demonstration. Some of those names and IDs were Michael Riconosciuto, researcher for Cabazon Indians; Peter Zakowski, president of Armtech Coachella; John D. Vanderwerker, research director for the CIA for 8 years. Earl Bryan, Wisconsin businessman and CIA employee. 2 Nicaraguan generals named Eden Pastora, aka Commander Zero, and Jose Curdel, aka Commander Alpha. John Philip Nichols, the Cabazon Indian manager. Scott Wesley of the United States Army, and others. It's beyond the scope of this video to cover in depth, but one of the Contra Army's other main sources of funding during this period was the importation of cocaine from Central America to the United States in an arrangement protected by the CIA. As later detailed in Gary Webb's Dark Alliance investigation, senior officials of the Contra Army were directly involved in supplying Freeway Rick Ross with tons of imported cocaine during the crack epidemic, which he then sold in a distribution network which fanned out from inner-city Los Angeles to cover most of the United States. Gary Webb discovered evidence that senior officials of the Reagan administration involved in Nicaragua policy were aware of the Contra involvement in cocaine trafficking, and the CIA was repeatedly accused of sabotaging drug trafficking investigations during this period in a scheme to protect the funding of American allies in Latin America. There's no direct evidence that Robert Booth Nichols was personally involved in these cocaine importation schemes, but it is notable that a reputed drug trafficker like Nichols was in such close contact with the Contras many years before their own drug trafficking was exposed. Obviously, no one knows for sure how many of these weapons were actually sold or given to the Contras through the Cabazon partnership, but the operations on the reservation would soon expand to include much more exotic types of arms. They began work on developing railguns and what they called enhanced gaseous fuel devices, extremely powerful explosives, which were supposed to produce an electromagnetic pulse that could disable communications infrastructure in a targeted area. Riconosciuto claimed they conducted tests of a prototype hydrodynamic implosion bomb built by Lawrence Livermore Labs, which left a 30-foot crater in the Nevada test range site. Sherry Seymour also discovered letters from John Philip Nichols, the Cabazon Band Reservation Administrator, suggesting they'd been working on biological and chemical warfare weapons on the reservation since at least 1983, attempting to solicit contracts from scientists at Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey, and eventually fronting some of the chemical weapons to the Japanese government. The partnership between Robert Booth Nichols and Michael Riconosciuto would dissolve after a mysterious trip the two made to a, quote, private installation in Alice Springs, Australia in 1984, likely the highly secretive Pine Gap surveillance base there, run jointly by American intelligence agencies and the Australian military. The two had a falling out during the trip and stopped speaking, effectively dissolving the joint venture at Cabazon. Riconosciuto would later be arrested for manufacturing amphetamines and served several decades in prison. John Philip Nichols would be implicated in multiple contract killings in and around the Cabazon Reservation, including the still technically unsolved triple murder of Fred Alvarez, Ralph Boger, and Patricia Castro, eventually serving a sentence for a murder-for-hire plot. But this wasn't the only highly politically sensitive operation Robert Booth Nichols was involved in the early 1980s. At the same time he was helping to traffic guns to the Contras, Nichols was a senior member of the board of FIDCO, or the First Intercontinental Development Corporation. According to Nichols' close friends and business associates, FIDCO was a National Security Council cutout created to allow the NSC to pursue covert policy objectives in Lebanon. FIDCO appears to have had 2 main objectives that left a surviving paper trail. One was to win the release of an American hostage being held there, and the other was to assist U.S. allied factions inside Lebanon with the rebuilding of parts of the country destroyed during the Lebanese Civil War and the second Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. The list of FIDCO's other board members gives another hint as to how enmeshed Nichols was with the power elite. Clint Murchison, the heir to a Dallas oil fortune and founder of the Dallas Cowboys. Michael McManus, the then current assistant to the president in Ronald Reagan's White House, and Robert Mayhew, a former FBI agent who had helped the CIA with various underworld operations, including their attempts to enlist the American mafia in plans to assassinate Fidel Castro, were all board members of FIDCO. Robert Mayhew had also managed some of the assets of the eccentric industrialist Howard Hughes. Now, Howard Hughes also had extensive CIA connections, most famously through Project Azorian, an operation in which Hughes let the CIA use his deep-sea drill ship, the Glomar Explorer, to search for a downed Soviet submarine in the Pacific Ocean. In 1980, a few years after Hughes died, Robert Booth Nichols had represented a group of unknown investors who wanted to take over the holding company which controlled Hughes's empire. According to Spy magazine, Nichols had convinced a Saudi company called Ali and Fahd Shabaksky Group to become partners in the failed takeover attempt. Joseph Scipio, who was at that time the London manager of Ali and Fahd, told Spy magazine he specifically remembered Nichols telling him he was representing interests in the U.S. government. Nichols showed him Justice Department identification and had highly confidential information, which Scipio believed could only have been acquired through government contacts. Years after this deal fell through, Joseph Scipio would be taken hostage in Lebanon. None of the extant sources detailed the exact circumstances of Scipio's abduction or what he was doing in Lebanon, but Sherry Seymour discovered documents which hint at Nichols' involvement in his rescue. Letters written in the summer of 1983 between FIDCO directors Michael McManus, then assistant to President Ronald Reagan at the White House, and George Pender, president of FIDCO, established that FIDCO had an important role to play in Lebanon. A follow-up letter, dated July 12, 1983, from Pender to Amin Gemayel, the president of Lebanon, indicated that all transactions should be telexed to 652483 RBN Associates LSA, which was Nichols' telex address at his Marina del Rey condo in California. The Arab Bank Limited in Amman, Jordan, responded that there would be no problem taking care of the U.S. $3 billion or more financial transaction. The $3 billion mentioned in the documents was used to pay the president of Lebanon, Amin Gemayel, for the release of an American prisoner being held in Lebanon, Joseph Scipio. Nichols' friend and business associate from the joint venture, Peter Sikosky, told Seymour that the prisoner was released as a result of FIDCO's efforts. Robert Booth Nichols handled the financial transaction. This was a FIDCO NSA operation in Lebanon. It's been United States policy not to negotiate with terrorists, including for the release of hostages, since well before the Reagan administration, and yet this apparent $3 billion ransom was authorized at the highest levels of the U.S. government and conducted in secret, using Nichols as the back channel to the Lebanese government. There's too little information in the public record about Scipio for informed speculation, but clearly he was very valuable to the U.S. government and may very well have been involved in other covert actions at the time he was abducted. It's also notable that the U.S. government seems to have paid a $3 billion ransom through a shell company called RBN Associates, controlled by Nichols, and registered to a condo he owned in California. Nichols himself was asked about FIDCO during his deposition in 2008 and claimed that FIDCO's objectives were to establish steel mills, listening posts or whatever, in Lagos, Nigeria, Abeokuta, Nigeria, Amman, Jordan, and proceed with negotiations to develop Velalar, the transportation area of Beirut, and rebuild the city of Demura, which had been heavily shelled at the time. Nichols told the author of The Last Circle, Sherry Seymour, "What the project was, I can tell you very clearly, there's nothing secret about it now, was to develop an agenda whereby all sides, the Muslim and the Christian sides in Lebanon, would come to an agreement on a redevelopment project to where their respective areas would have the same capitalization and the same benefit to stop the fighting." Seymour asked, "Did this include rebuilding of the infrastructure of Beirut?" "Very definitely," Nichols said. "Did this have anything to do with FIDCO?" FIDCO was involved in it, right. That was an effort by that company, as I understood it. The project was to make sure that both sides developed building programs that were initiated concurrently, and the development was fair and equitable to all sides to stop the fighting. Unlike with the Contra connection, the question of what specific U.S. interests the National Security Council was pursuing in Lebanon through FIDCO doesn't have an obvious answer. Lebanon was a highly sectarian society. It had been the only majority Christian country in the Middle East, until the creation and repeated expansion of the State of Israel forced Muslim refugees into Lebanese territory, which, combined with Christian emigration and differential birth rates, caused a swift demographic transformation that destabilized the country. The United States and Israel both allied with the Maronite Christian militias and the legal government of Lebanon during the Civil War, against fighters from Syria, Islamic militant groups, and the PLO, which recruited heavily from the permanent refugee camps sheltering thousands of exiled Palestinians in southern Lebanon. The conflict was marred by frequent sectarian massacres and human rights abuses, and the United States deployed a multinational force of American and European soldiers, ostensibly for peacekeeping, in 1982, which would have been active during the period of FIDCO's operations. But after the bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks there in October of 1983, the American soldiers were withdrawn within a year. The person Nichols was apparently paying the ransom to, Amin Gemayel, the president of Lebanon, was part of the powerful Gemayel family, leaders of the Maronite Phalangist Kataeb Party, a nationalist political party and paramilitary group originally modeled on the Nazis, which had participated in a number of massacres against Palestinians and Muslims, including the Sabra and Shatila and Tel al-Zatar massacres. It's certainly possible that Nichols' explanation for his involvement there, funding simultaneous building projects for different sectarian groups active in the war, so they would all be incentivized to stop the fighting and focus on rebuilding their bombed-out cities, was a legitimate policy goal of the American government in Lebanon. But in 1985, less than 2 years after FIDCO's known operations in the country, the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee determined that Gemayel's finance minister was supervising the importation of Turkish opium into Lebanon, which was processed into heroin and eventually smuggled into the United States. In an interview with a journalist named Kelly O'Meara, Nichols' friend and business partner, the arms manufacturer Peter Zakowski, explained Nichols' role in the drug trade. O'Meara asked, where did the money for the Cabazon joint venture with Wackenhut come from? Zakowski said it came from the NSA. He explained that the NSA doesn't have to account for money. The NSA makes a profit. He alluded that some of the money came from drug profits. He said he was told that the only people that get busted for drugs are those that don't have a distribution territory. He said drugs are called gold and used as currency worldwide. Real gold takes up space and is difficult to transport. Payments are made for arms with drugs. Drugs are a business at the highest levels of corporations because there's a huge market and demand for drugs. The corporations distribute drugs because there's a demand for them. In other words, it's just a pervasive business, and everyone is involved in one way or another, including government front corporations. O'Meara asked if Nichols was involved in doing contract work relative to government narcotics transactions. Zakowski replied that Nichols doesn't use drugs or distribute drugs. He handles the corporate and government transactions at a higher level. He said Nichols is in the business of service for money. He added that all business transactions conducted covertly today relate to two things, money and drugs. In an interview with Sherry Seymour, Nichols' longtime friend and business partner, Michael Riconosciuto, claimed that FIDCO's operations in Lebanon were directly tied to the drug trade. According to Riconosciuto, quote, when FIDCO was wheeling and dealing on financing for the reconstruction of the infrastructure of Beirut in Lebanon, they were making sweetheart deals with Syrian mobsters and the brother of the president of Syria, Hafez Assad. I should note here that the Syrian government was one of the primary combatants in the Lebanese civil war. Back to Riconosciuto, quote, the intelligence people, in their infinite wisdom, decided to capitalize on the long-standing battle between Rafat Assad and his group and the Jafar family, a prominent, heavily armed Shiite tribal group with a significant presence in the Bekaa Valley region of Lebanon. Selectively, they were backing both people, but they were also playing them off against one another, developing networks. They got a bunch of prominent Syrians thoroughly compromised, and they were in tow in the intelligence game. And they had people that could get me in and out of the Bekaa Valley, even out of certain areas of Syria. From an intelligence standpoint, it was a success. But to maintain the credibility of those intelligence operations, the heroin had to flow, to make it real. And the stuff was starting to accumulate in a warehouse outside of Larnaca. I personally was in a warehouse where there was upwards of 22 tons. And even though it was packaged for shipment, the smell of it in that closed warehouse was overpowering. You know, white heroin like that has a certain odor because of the way it's processed. They had authorization for what they called controlled deliveries into the United States, and they'd target certain cities and then follow the stuff out, ostensibly unmasking the network and conducting prosecutions. However, the operation became perverted at the U.S. end of the pipeline. Controlled heroin shipments were doubled, sometimes tripled, and only 1/3 of the heroin was returned to the DEA. At a certain transfer point at the airport in Larnaca, the excess baggage from the original controlled delivery would be allowed to go through. I was given the names of the narcotics people who were handling that. Riconosciuto is an unreliable narrator, to be sure, but there are certain data points in his narrative that seem to check out. Robert Booth Nichols definitely appears to have spent time in Lebanon during the period of his partnership with Riconosciuto, which was contemporaneous with the FIDCO operations. The Jafar family really is a prominent Muslim paramilitary group in Lebanon, specifically in the Bekaa Valley, where Riconosciuto claims this all took place. And there really is an airport in the city of Larnaca, which 99% of Americans have presumably never heard of. The idea that American intelligence agencies would fund both sides of a conflict, in this case both the ruling family of Syria and the Jafar paramilitary clan, while doing deals with Syrian mobsters, can't be that far-fetched, because we just went over another case of the Reagan administration doing the exact same thing in the Iran-Iraq War and the Contra cocaine pipeline. And Riconosciuto was saying all this during an interview from prison in the early 90s. It's not like he could have just Googled it. This is not to say we should trust what Riconosciuto says completely. He became notorious in the 1990s and 2000s for sending octopus researchers on wild goose chases from his prison cell, and his stories are often peppered with exaggerations and outright lies, which is why this video largely avoids his testimony. But in this particular case, the details he provides are too accurate to dismiss out of hand. Peter Zakowski, another interview subject of Seymour's, was a consultant to the British government and the former president of the weapons manufacturing company Armtec, which was the sole source supplier of 120mm combustible cartridge cases to the U.S. government in the early 80s. At the time of his association with Nichols, Zakowski was reportedly one of only 6 or 7 people in the world who had any significant experience in the development and manufacture of the slurry process involved in combustible cartridge cases. Zakowski knew Robert Booth Nichols for years, often serving on the boards of his companies, and he'd been seen at the shooting range meeting between the Contras and the Wackenhut joint venture that was surveilled by local police. His interviews with Sherry Seymour contain some of the most detailed information on Nichols' background in the public record, but to be clear, he's the sole source for most of it, and like many things in the Octopus case, virtually all of what he says is impossible to confirm. Nevertheless, in the interest of completeness, it's worth going over his testimony. This is Sherry Seymour's account of a meeting between herself, Peter Zakowski, and the journalist Kelly O'Meara mentioned earlier. O'Meara said she'd heard that Robert Booth Nichols was a thug, a drug trafficker, and a money launderer. Zakowski chuckled and said he's probably all 3 of those things. He said it's his understanding that Nichols works for the NSC, adding, "Everything revolves around the NSC." He explained that Nichols does contract work for the NSA and NSC, but also occasionally does contract work for other government agencies. Zakowski claimed that Nichols had done some unspecified contract work for Ross Perot in Vietnam. Seymour says in The Last Circle that she got the impression this was some kind of financial venture, but there's one other possibility that should be considered. Ross Perot was heavily involved in the Vietnam POW MIA issue. In the years following the Vietnam War, some Americans became convinced that there were significant numbers of surviving American prisoners of war still being held in Vietnam, who the American government had falsely counted as dead or missing in action for reasons of political expediency. Ross Perot famously dedicated lots of time and money to the search for these alleged missing POWs, even though the cause was widely derided as a conspiracy theory in the American media. As we'll see later, Robert Booth Nichols had a habit of insinuating himself into popular, well-known conspiracy theories that were the subject of media attention, so although it's certainly possible that he was working on a business venture there, the connection between Ross Perot, Vietnam, and the POW MIA issue seems too coincidental to ignore. Zakowski said he was told by an NSA employee that the NSA is a profit agency, and the funding to the NSA is unlimited and no accountability is required, because the NSA is national security and doesn't disclose what the money is used for. He said FIDCO was an NSA front corporation used in Lebanon. All the FIDCO corporate directors were intelligence people. They contracted with Nichols to do work for them. Zakowski said whenever anyone submits a Freedom of Information Act request to the DOJ about Nichols, Nichols gets notified about it. Zukoski discussed his exploits with Wackenhut at the Cabazon Indian Reservation beginning in 1981. He talked about the proposed development of biological warfare viruses being developed in cow uteri by Stormont Laboratories. He said Nichols and the others presented a proposal to develop biological warfare technology at Stormont Labs, along with antitoxin kits, and sell it to the Army. This technology was also presented for sale to FMC Corporation in California, the creators of the Bradley fighting vehicle. Zukoski also discussed the weapons demonstration at the shooting range with the Wackenhut joint venture people and the Contras. Zukoski had been present at this meeting. Some inexpensive rifles and night vision goggles were tested. He said the rifles could be manufactured at the reservation at a cost of $30 per rifle. Zukoski seems to be one of the more credible characters in the entire Octopus saga. He was a retired arms manufacturer at the time of his involvement in the case and was described by Seymour as Nichols' friend and mentor. But Seymour goes out of her way to stress how nice, stable, and intelligent Zukoski and his wife were, in contrast to the other characters involved, like Michael Riconosciuto. As with everything in this case, his testimony needs to be taken with a grain of salt, but at the very least, it does provide a window into how Nichols was perceived by those around him in the arms manufacturing world. By the mid-80s, Nichols was based in Zurich, Switzerland. Despite having no apparent means of income, he listed homes including a multi-million-dollar villa in Italy, a chateau on the Côte d'Azur, a flat in the Mayfair district of London, and a house in an exclusive suburb of Queensland, Australia called St. Lucia. But according to the journalist Guy Lawson, when the Iran-Contra scandal broke in 1986, years after the Wackenhut joint venture, Nichols claimed that he'd been disowned by the CIA, along with many others associated with the Oliver North faction in the Reagan administration. Lawson doesn't tell us his source for this information, but it's certainly plausible. The Iran-Contra gun-running schemes were being directed by Ronald Reagan's National Security Council, so if Nichols really had been a contractor for the NSC, then being connected to a disastrous scandal like Iran-Contra could certainly result in the loss of contracting work. According to Guy Lawson, in the aftermath of the Iran-Contra scandal, Nichols moved back to Los Angeles and apparently began shopping some screenplays he had written, including one called Acceptable Casualty, a story about rogue CIA operatives releasing a genetically engineered AIDS virus to cull the gay population. In Hollywood, Nichols became acquainted with the powerful Hollywood lobbyist and MPAA executive Jack Valenti, and the former deputy director of the CIA and founder of the investment firm the Carlyle Group, Frank Carlucci. And somehow, Nichols soon found himself working for the powerful entertainment conglomerate MCA during a period when the company had extensive connections with both the Reagan White House and organized crime. And for this next part, we're going to have to zoom out again. At this point in the story, it's 1986. Ronald Reagan is in the middle of his second term as president. Before winning the presidency in 1980, he'd been a two-term governor of the state of California, but Reagan actually started his professional life as an actor and Screen Actors Guild president. During this phase of his career, Reagan developed deep connections with MCA, its president Lew Wasserman, and a host of mafia figures who exercised power in Hollywood through their control of the company. According to the book Dark Victory, Ronald Reagan, MCA, and the Mob by the journalist Dan Moldea, Ronald Reagan and his closest friends have portrayed and defended the president's business transactions with MCA, which date back to 1940, as being totally above suspicion. But there remain numerous unanswered questions and allegations about the relationship between Reagan and MCA. These doubts raise delicate issues that involve possible personal and political payoffs, as well as links to major mafia figures, particularly Beverly Hills attorney Sidney Korshak, who's been described by federal investigators as the principal link between the legitimate business world and organized crime. Over the course of Reagan's two-decade political career, he'd refused to answer any in-depth questions about how he amassed his personal wealth, by 1986 estimated at more than $4 million. That's almost $12 million in 2025 dollars. In 1976, when he first ran for president, and again in 1980 and 1984, Reagan managed to avoid any intense scrutiny of his finances. His financial ties to MCA have been virtually ignored, relegated to the category of ancient history. By 1986, MCA had become the owner of the largest motion picture and television production companies in the United States, Universal Pictures and Universal Television, headquartered at Universal City, California, with offices in major cities all over the world. The rise of MCA and its move to Hollywood paralleled the rise of the Chicago mafia and its infiltration of the motion picture industry. While MCA was representing some of the top motion picture stars, Chicago mobsters took control of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, or IATSE, the major Hollywood labor union, through Willie Beoff, a small-time hood who was supervised by Chicago mob lieutenant Johnny Rosselli. The studios made payoffs to the underworld for labor peace and to keep their workers' wages and benefits to a minimum. But when the studio's payoff man was caught for evading federal income taxes, he plea bargained with the government, implicating Beoff but not the mafia in the extortion scheme. Beoff was indicted and convicted, and then turned state's evidence against his cohorts, who were also convicted and sent to prison. The Chicago Mafia's role in Hollywood didn't end with the convictions, it simply changed. Chicago's new liaison in the motion picture industry became attorney Sidney Korshak, who had represented Beoff. Charles Gio, a top Chicago Mafia figure, had told Beoff that Korshak was our man. Any message he may deliver to you is a message from us. A close friend of MCA president Lew Wasserman's, Sidney Korshak quickly became one of the most powerful influences in the entertainment industry and in California politics. Ronald Reagan, a young actor who was represented by Wasserman and MCA, was a star player during the investigation and hearings by the U.S. House Un-American Activities Committee, serving as both an informant for the FBI and a friendly witness for the committee. After his performance in the war against communism, Reagan was rewarded by being elected as president of the Screen Actors Guild, serving for 5 consecutive one-year terms. In 1952, during his 5th term, Reagan engineered a blanket waiver exempting MCA from SAG rules, prohibiting a talent agency from also engaging in film production. MCA was the only such firm to have been granted such a favored status, giving it the ground floor in television production. It placed the company in a position where it could offer jobs to the actors it represented. Other talent agencies complained that this situation gave MCA an unfair advantage. Soon after Reagan's tenure as SAG president ended, he found himself in serious financial trouble. With his film career on the skids, Reagan was saved by MCA with jobs in Las Vegas and on television. According to Justice Department documents, several government sources believed that the preferential treatment Reagan received from MCA was a payoff for services rendered while Reagan was the president of SAG. According to law enforcement authorities, when Reagan began his first run for governor in 1966, several of his campaign financiers were close friends and associates of the powerful Hollywood mafia fixer Sidney Korshak. Joel Stein and Taft Schreiber, Reagan's backers at MCA, as well as his personal attorney, Los Angeles labor lawyer William French Smith, made several questionable financial transactions on Reagan's behalf, making him a multimillionaire overnight. Once governor, Reagan made executive decisions that were greatly beneficial to MCA and other corporations with motion picture studio interests. During the presidential campaign, Reagan met privately with known associates of organized crime and appointed others to his personal campaign staff. Several of these people were later given high positions in the Reagan administration after his election. President Reagan talked tough about the organized crime problem in the United States, while surrounding himself with many who are closely linked to those who have created it. So to be clear, Ronald Reagan had started his show business career at MCA's talent agency with Lew Wasserman as his agent, then became the head of the Screen Actors Guild and worked out special corrupt deals for MCA that allowed the company to grow into one of the biggest entertainment conglomerates on earth. And then MCA paid Reagan back by cutting him in on shady real estate deals and backing his political campaigns, all while MCA was deeply connected to the mafia. Reagan was still on good terms with the company during his presidency and remained close with MCA's president, his former agent Lew Wasserman. At the same time that MCA was giving the mafia its foothold in Hollywood, the company stacked its board with influential political figures, like the former Republican Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker, who would soon be appointed Reagan's chief of staff, and former DNC chairman Robert Strauss. And Robert Booth Nichols, who had just spent the last several years doing international gun running, money laundering, and possibly drug trafficking for Ronald Reagan's National Security Council, somehow randomly ends up working for MCA after the Iran-Contra scandal breaks. But around the same time that Nichols joined MCA, a federal organized crime strike force began looking into the connections between MCA and the mafia. According to one of the federal prosecutors involved, Marvin Rudnick, there were actually 2 parallel investigations into MCA's mob ties being conducted simultaneously. One investigation centered on a mob-connected seafood and meat wholesaler named Salvatore "Sal the Swindler" Pisello, who suddenly began conducting multi-million-dollar deals for MCA's music business, despite having no experience in the music industry.
The mob, organized crime, has been a force in Hollywood almost since the advent of talking pictures. 50 years ago, when actors like Edward G. Robinson and Paul Muni were playing gangsters in movies like Little Caesar and Scarface, the mob was already in Hollywood playing for real. Everybody knew it, certainly the Justice Department did, but it wasn't until just a few years ago that any real effort was made to prove it.
We uncovered a strong outside connection with the East Coast families, the Genovese family, the Gambino family. We uncovered a strong presence with Chicago organized crime, with a syndicate at various levels within the motion picture and television industry.
Until earlier this year, Richard Staven was in charge of a major Justice Department FBI organized crime strike force investigation into the mob's infiltration of Hollywood.
We have been led to believe, not only through this investigation but other investigations, that the mob has moved off to the streets and they're in the boardrooms of corporate America.
The investigations of the mob in Hollywood touched on a number of entertainment companies, but 2 of the most revealing investigations focused on people associated with one studio in particular, MCA. MCA stands for the Music Corporation of America, a $3 billion entertainment conglomerate known for its Universal Studios, which produces network television programs like Murder, She Wrote, as well as movies. MCA also has a record division which offers up the songs of superstars like Elton John, and still another division entertains millions of tourists annually at its Universal Studio theme park. So how did the mob turn up doing business with MCA? The first evidence was uncovered 4 years ago by Marvin Rudnick, one of Richard Staven's colleagues in the Justice Department strike force. Rudnick was prosecuting a man identified by the FBI as an organized crime figure, Salvatore "Sal the Swindler" Pisello. When a witness told him that Pisello, a wholesaler in seafoods and meat, was now in Hollywood doing business with MCA.
Mr. Pisello was arranging multi-million-dollar transactions at MCA Records, which was in one of the large divisions at MCA. I was floored. I was surprised that somebody who would be involved in the meat business and had these organized crime ties would be doing any kind of business over in Hollywood.
I mean, MCA is not in the meat business.
No, and Pisello was also in the pizza business on the side, and he was also in the ice cream business.
He wasn't selling pizza and ice cream and sausage and meats to Universal's kitchens.
No, not based on what we found.
Did he have any background in this business?
That was what got us interested. There was no reason to believe that Sal Pisello knew anything about the record business.
Rudnick discovered and reported to the Justice Department that Pisello, the racketeer meat and pizza man turned record executive, had the run of MCA's offices, met with top MCA executives, and that Pisello had arranged a series of multi-million-dollar deals, including MCA's purchase of the prize Chess Checker record catalog, giving MCA the rights to the songs and music of black blues and rock and roll artists of the 50s and 60s. Bill Needles-Sater was a reporter at the Los Angeles Times investigating the record business. He reported that Pisello was involved in the distribution of millions of MCA records called cutouts. Cutouts are records that are sold in bulk at discount because they are no longer in demand. Needles-Sater reported in the LA Times that Sal Pisello, the alleged mobster, was MCA's favorite middleman in the cutout record business.
The MCA, through Sal Pisello, sold about 5 million cutouts to a Philadelphia budget distributor for about $1.5 million, 35 cents a piece. What happened was, when he got the records, received them in his warehouse, he found that the better titles had been taken out. They had creamed his load in cutout parlance.
The records that would sell easiest.
Yeah, the ones he could get $2 and $3 for, or $1. So he refused to pay and got his face broken.
This is an FBI photo of the distributor's face after he was visited by a mafioso from New Jersey. Pacello made hundreds of thousands of dollars doing business with MCA, and much of it went into the accounts of this company, a partnership between Pacello and 2 members of the mafia. One of his partners was this man, Fritzy Giovanelli, who was recently jailed for killing a New York City police detective. MCA also advanced Sal Pacello $180,000. Facing an audit, an MCA executive asked Pacello for 3 checks to cover that amount, checks that were never cashed but were kept locked in an executive's desk drawer in case they were needed.
And MCA got 3 checks for Pacello for $180,000.
That's right.
They were undated.
They were undated.
MCA knew the checks were no good. There wasn't enough money to cover them.
They knew at the time they took them they were worthless.
How did Sal Pacello get inside MCA? Did the company's executives know he was in the mob? MCA's executives insisted they didn't know, but they and others involved in the Pacello record deals told Marvin Rudnick contradictory stories about how the mobster got into MCA. To try and get to the bottom of the MCA-Pacello connection, Rudnick checked to see if Pacello had paid taxes on income from doing business with the company. He hadn't. And so with the support of the IRS and the endorsement of the Justice Department in Washington, Rudnick launched a grand jury investigation. In July of 1987, the grand jury indicted Sal Pacello for evading taxes on the money he made doing business with MCA. And while the press was preoccupied with the Pacello MCA case, Richard Staven and the FBI were involved in still another investigation of the mob's infiltration of Hollywood.
Every day there was a surprise to me in this case. Every conversation was a surprise to me in this case. Every day there was a new mafia figure that surfaced. We still don't know the full breadth of the mafia's involvement in Hollywood.
Richard Staven, now in private practice in Los Angeles, agreed to talk with us about his investigation and what has appeared on the public record about FBI wiretaps involving Hollywood, the mob, and one high-ranking MCA executive.
The conversations spanned what we perceive to be potential insider trading violations concerning MCA's stock. Certain conversations also dealt with the motion picture that was to be produced on the life of Meyer Lansky, wherein there were 2 competing organized crime families that were trying to control this production, the Genovese family and the Gambino family.
They wanted to control the production of the movie?
They wanted to control the production, and by that I mean they wanted to control who actually did produce the movie. There were 2 competing stories that were being pitched around town.
One by Eugene Giaquinto, vice president of MCA's home video division. Giaquinto is seen here with MCA's president, Sidney Sheinberg.
And Giaquinto from MCA wants to make the movie, and he's got connections with
The Gambino family in New York.
And on his wiretap phone, Giaquinto got more specific.
Giaquinto, at that point, said he was going to enlist the aid of John Gotti and the Gambino family in New York to intercede on their behalf to make sure that they could produce their movie.
The competing project belonged to the actor James Caan, who played Sonny, the hot-headed Corleone in the Godfather movies. Caan's project was the one the Genovese crime family wanted produced.
And the FBI heard this in wiretaps?
That's correct.
What does that say about mob control, at least in this instance, here in Hollywood?
The mafia looks at films about the mafia as though they have a proprietary interest in it. And if a movie is going to be made about the mafia, you had better consult with the mafia before you make that movie and pay your tribute.
Not only did the mob want to control movies, they wanted to control the packaging of the home videos. According to Staven's investigation, MCA spent millions of dollars printing home video cassette boxes like these with a mob-affiliated company. The company was affiliated with this man, Edward Chandra, a mafia underboss, who Giaquinto described on those FBI wiretaps as his uncle.
The conversations are quite clear that Giaquinto was the mafia's man within MCA, whether or not known to MCA executives or not. But it was quite clear that in time, the mafia had hoped to get Giaquinto in the position where he was running the entire studio.
Richard Stavin says that based on the public record in these two criminal cases, MCA should have known that their vice president and their home video division were doing business with a mob-affiliated printing company. And one high-level source in MCA agreed. He told us that objections were raised inside by executives as to why Giaquinto could use a printing company 3,000 miles away in New Jersey. Despite the questions, MCA's top management, including Chief Executive Lou Wasserman, seen here with Giaquinto, made no changes. And according to those FBI wiretaps, Giaquinto, MCA's vice president, not only bragged about his mob ties, he made a perhaps more damaging admission, that he was aware that 4 movies were made with laundered money, the proceeds of crime.
In Hollywood, the deal is what counts. It's the bottom line. It's getting the picture produced on budget and within the allotted shooting time. Nobody asks how, and nobody asks where the money's come from.
MCA's chief executive and board chairman is Lou Wasserman, considered the most politically powerful Hollywood mogul, a confidant of presidents. Neither Wasserman nor any member of MCA's politically powerful board of directors, a board that includes former Senate Republican leader Howard Baker and former Democratic National Committee Chairman Robert Strauss, would talk with us on camera about these allegations, nor would any executive or attorney for MCA. And neither would Eugene Giaquinto, who was suspended by MCA when the Stavin FBI probe first became public. But MCA did respond to at least one of those government investigations, Marvin Rudnick's probe of Sal Pacello and MCA records. MCA complained to the federal government about Rudnick's legal ethics and conduct in court.
The Department of Justice turned on me. I mean, one day they liked me, the next day they didn't.
Why?
A new lawyer was hired on behalf of MCA. It was a lawyer from Washington named Mr. Hundley, Bill Hundley.
That new MCA lawyer, Bill Hundley, just happened to be the former head, in fact, the man who started the Justice Department's organized crime section, the group Marvin Rudnick worked for. So it was easy for Hundley to call up Rudnick's bosses and meet with them over lunch. Hundley, a law partner of MCA board member Robert Strauss, freely admits that they discussed MCA, Marvin Rudnick, and the Pacello case. And it wasn't long after that that Rudnick was called back to Washington for a meeting at headquarters and given the word.
My chief said, Bill Hundley is a friend of the strike force, and pointed to a picture on the wall. And he said, that's Bill Hundley. If he starts complaining about you, you've got troubles.
Jim Waltz, now in private practice, served in the Justice Department with Marvin Rudnick.
Here's a guy who's a prosecutor who discovered evidence of organized crime and was investigating it and ferreting it out. It's that simple. And he stepped on toes. People didn't like it. MCA, who's got a lot of money, hired a lot of legal talent, and somebody was gotten to in the Department of Justice.
Was it clear after this meeting that the Justice Department and someone high up in the Justice Department didn't want you going after MCA?
It was clear to me. I mean, it's not like they brought me into Washington to give me some kind of a medal.
Rudnick says his chief told him to leave Los Angeles to accept a transfer, and therefore give up being the prosecutor in the pending trial of Sal Pacello. The Department of Justice had already sent MCA this letter assuring the company it and its executives were not a target of the Pacello investigation. Despite the pressure, Marvin Rudnick refused his chief's suggestion and returned to Los Angeles, where he successfully prosecuted and convicted Sal Pacello for evading taxes on his income, $300,000 he made doing business with MCA. Despite his victory in the Pacello trial last July, the Department of Justice fired Marvin Rudnick.
They gave no cause, no basis, no justification, and it was just totally improper. They gave me no hearing. This was all designed as part of some way of trying to discredit the case.
Ed Dennis is head of the criminal division in the U.S. Department of Justice. He fired Marvin Rudnick. We wanted to know why.
I will not discuss any personnel matters involving Mr. Rudnick or anyone else in the department.
Dennis rejected any inference that MCA's use of an ex-strike force chief, Bill Hundley, was improper, or that it might have influenced the Department of Justice's decisions concerning MCA or the firing of Rudnick.
These personnel matters really, when you look at them, came down to personality disputes involving really matters that are perhaps unfortunate, but they certainly don't raise the implications that you've brought out here.
Personality disputes. He didn't get along with somebody?
That's basically it.
This is not a matter of personality dispute. This is a matter of integrity. There's no personality matter involved here. All we were trying to do is get to the truth. The real question in this case is, how did a man, a mob guy, with no prior experience in the record business, get into MCA? I mean, the priority should be to look toward what the mob influence is, wherever it is.
And Richard Staven, he is no longer with the Department of Justice either. He wasn't fired, he resigned last June. Staven didn't want to tell us why, but sources in the Justice Department and the FBI say he was frustrated over delays and objections raised inside the department. Objections to the issuing of indictments in his probe of the mob in Hollywood.
Is there an ongoing investigation into possible mob influence through Sal Pacello or others into MCA?
That our investigations insofar as mob influence are concerned are always open. They never close.
The head of MCA, Lou Wasserman, had hired a mob-connected labor fixer named Marty Bacow to deal with MCA's problems with the Teamsters that had developed on the set of their show, Miami Vice. According to the book, Mr. and Mrs. Hollywood by Kathleen Sharp, the Federal Organized Crime Strike Force was looking at Marty Bacow as part of a larger investigation of the mob's influence in Hollywood. Richard Staven, an attorney on the force, knew of Bacow's long-standing ties to gangsters. FBI files listed him as an arbitrator in disputes between the Teamsters, IATSE, the other powerful Hollywood union, and the studios, a possible conflict of interest, if not an outright violation of labor laws. We believe he was taking care of labor peace in the industry. He wasn't on the level of infamous Hollywood mobster Sidney Korshak, said Staven, but he boasted to others about his association with Teamsters officials. He also bragged that he could get MCA president Lou Wasserman or his wife Edie on the phone any time. The strike force had collected these tidbits from wiretaps and various other sources. One of the first names that came up was the chief of MCA's video division, Gene Giaquinto, said Staven. The MCA executive often talked with Bacow, and at first, the federal attorneys couldn't believe their ears. Giaquinto kept referring to the Gambino family boss, John Gotti, and other known crime figures. During our investigation, it became abundantly clear that Gene Giaquinto had significant ties to the mob, said Staven. For one thing, there was his quote-unquote uncle, Ed Chandra, the mobster whose North Star graphics company in New Jersey packed MCA videocassettes at extortionary prices, and now the references to John Gotti. Staven told his supervisors in Washington, D.C. about his findings, and a federal judge approved a request to expand the wiretaps. But instead of finding a clear answer to the mysteries, Staven stumbled into more intrigue. Giaquinto was now talking to Robert Booth Nichols, a CIA character who skulked around the airfields of Miami. FBI files listed him as being tied to the Gambinos, a guy involved in narcotics and money laundering, said Staven. Nichols and Giaquinto discussed a joint venture in which Nichols would travel the globe to stamp out bootleg copies of Universal shows like Miami Vice, and thus protect MCA's copyrighted works. Nichols would be able to use dozens of MCA offices around the world. What Staven didn't realize was that Nichols was already working with General Richard Secord, then Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and a point man for the Iran-Contra effort. One of Secord's agents, retired U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander Al Martin, recalled meeting Nichols in Miami. Nichols had 8 different Social Security numbers and 4 different dates of birth, said Martin, who said he helped launder money through friendly American corporations. That's how Martin met Nichols, a dapper spook who looked like Clark Gable and moved like James Bond. According to Martin, Nichols was laundering money too, but strike force investigators didn't know this for certain. Nichols was in the government, but not exactly in the government, said Staven. When government investigators heard that MCA wanted to hire Nichols to stamp out pirated works, Staven realized that the job could be a cover for a clandestine operation. It was our feeling that we might have stumbled onto another Iran-Contra, said Staven. MCA could pay for Nichols to travel, visit certain countries, and act as a bagman to deliver money to foreign nations. We didn't know that for a fact, Stavin stressed, but that possibility became one of our working assumptions. As for MCA's association with North Star Graphics, Stavin and his Justice Department supervisors theorized that it might be a similar cover. Perhaps MCA was funneling money in the video box business through Nichols to get to where the money needed to go abroad. Such a scenario was no more preposterous than the gun-running Iran-Contra plot currently being produced by the White House, and it was one of several possibilities that the strike force considered. One thing was certain. The mob was inside MCA through its business dealings with the New Jersey video packager. Stavin and his supervisors wanted to know how deep the penetration went. This could be the biggest prosecution of Stavin's career, and his strike force team began to build a case. The second federal investigation, run by FBI Special Agent Thomas Gates and federal prosecutor Richard Stavin, focused on Robert Booth Nichols, his company Meridian International Logistics, MCA executive Eugene Giaquinto, and several related organized crime figures. According to a successful warrant application to wiretap the phones of Nichols and his associates, they were suspected of extortion, illegally accessing government documents, fraud, stock manipulation, and drug trafficking, among other crimes. Sherry Seymour was able to access some of the FBI reports detailing Nichols and Giaquinto's wiretapped phone conversations. Giaquinto was recorded describing Robert Booth Nichols as his government man and a super sleuth who was higher than the CIA and had an ID card that appeared to indicate he was an official of the U.S. Treasury Department. Everyone we talked to in Hollywood thought Nichols was a CIA undercover hitman, FBI Special Agent Thomas Gates recalled. Giaquinto was intercepted telling Marty Bacow, the labor fixer, that Nichols was providing him computer printouts with seemingly confidential government information about indictments and other ongoing investigations that could only have come from inside the DOJ. Richard Stavin, one of the federal prosecutors working on the case, said that he and FBI agent Thomas Gates, quote, were astounded by the comments Giaquinto made about Robert Booth Nichols as to what information he could get from the federal government. Agent Gates said that the FBI wiretap, quote, extensively documented Robert Booth Nichols' connection with the highest levels of the U.S. Department of Justice, and that Nichols was warned by the DOJ that the FBI was investigating him. The conversation between Nichols and the DOJ official was even picked up on the FBI's wiretap. There was a close working relationship between the board of directors of MCA, Reagan's Attorney General Edwin Meese, and the Reagan White House, Gates said. Remember, the board of directors of MCA included Howard Baker, who took a job as Reagan's chief of staff in between stints at MCA, and Lou Wasserman, Reagan's former agent and personal friend of several decades, who'd given him millions of dollars in corrupt real estate deals. The wiretaps also captured Eugene Giaquinto telling Nichols about a money laundering operation for heroin money that involved restaurants owned by mobsters in New York and allegedly the record division of MCA. Then came a strange, slightly ludicrous twist right out of a pulp spy novel. Giaquinto met Robert Booth Nichols for lunch at Les Dômes in Hollywood, and while the two were eating, FBI agents ran the license plates of Nichols' car. They traced the plates to Harold Okamoto, a leader in a Hawaiian syndicate that owned casinos around the world. FBI agents also learned that Okamoto had worked with Frank Carlucci, a former deputy director of the CIA, who in November 1987 would become Secretary of Defense. Stavin and his chiefs were floored. Nichols and his work had the look of a covert operation. Further investigation revealed that Nichols was president of Meridian Arms, a subsidiary of Meridian International Logistics that had both CIA and organized crime connections, according to Lieutenant Commander Al Martin, a Seacourt associate who was Nichols' acquaintance from the Iran-Contra operation. Hold on, thought Stavin. This is way beyond our purview. Stavin and other federal officers wondered if MCA was helping the government move money and resources around the world. And then, just as federal prosecutors and FBI agents were beginning to uncover the true scope of the criminal enterprise at MCA, their investigation was stopped from above. According to the FBI agent on the case, Thomas Gates, the MCA executive and Gambino associate Eugene Giaquinto somehow got tipped off that he and MCA were being investigated by the feds, and the wiretap caught a conversation between Giaquinto and mafia labor fixer Martin Bacow. in which Giaquinto said that he was going to have Reagan's Attorney General Edwin Meese call off the investigation. And soon after, that's exactly what happened. In May 1988, Giaquinto learned about the government investigation of him. He went ballistic. MCA's executive, Giaquinto, had had enough. "I'm calling Meese and getting this thing stopped right now," he said. Sure enough, after Giaquinto dropped Meese's name, the 3 cases against MCA, the payola, videocassettes, and record investigations, began to lose steam. Years later, Marvin Rudnick said in an interview that this is a cover-up that goes all the way to the top. Other attorneys and investigators said they believed that Wasserman and Meese had covered up a larger case of mob infiltration and CIA influence at MCA. It's not just happenstance that 2 of MCA's presidents of 2 of their major divisions are doing business with the mob, said Stavin. In an email to prosecutor Richard Stavin, Rudnick wrote, "I remember someone in the prosecutor's office telling me that your wiretaps included a call that went right into the White House. I figured you either had a great case or you too would be fired." Of course, Stavin was fired. In March 1992, Stavin, Rudnick, FBI agent Thomas Gates, and others were called to testify before a House Judiciary Committee about these and other matters. The committee, headed by Representative Jack Brooks of Texas, collected depositions from Rudnick and Stavin, who separately detailed their strike force findings. Stavin discussed the ties between Gene Giaquinto and Robert Booth Nichols. Stavin believed that MCA was helping the government by offering the cover of its offices around the world. Later, to the surprise of both Stavin and Rudnick, the committee didn't discount that. "They indicated that we were closer than we initially believed," said Stavin. "They felt that there were other Iran-Contras out there, besides Ollie North's deal." Added Rudnick, Giaquinto was on the board of a company that dealt with CIA, which is part of what the Judiciary Committee was investigating. In 1989, after the organized crime strike force investigation was closed, Robert Booth Nichols actually sued the FBI agent who'd been investigating him, Thomas Gates, in Los Angeles Superior Court, alleging that Gates had defamed him and interfered with his ability to do business overseas, especially in Australia and Japan, where Gates had contacted local authorities, apparently seeking information on Nichols. When asked to describe the lawsuit during his 2008 deposition in the Sam Israel Ponzi scheme case, Nichols said that Gates, quote, "had made statements that I was a member of the Gambia or some, I think, Gambia crime family, pretending not to remember his own association with the Gambinos." Around the same time, Nichols also sued the LAPD for allegedly ruining a multi-million-dollar deal to sell machine guns to foreign governments. The lawsuit was even written up in the LA Times under the headline, "Trial Offers Murky Peek into World of Intrigue." By taking the city to court for false arrest, Nichols, 50, could earn a multi-million-dollar damage award. But the lawsuit, stemming from a 1986 incident at the Palomino nightclub in North Hollywood, has also served to draw Nichols out of the shadows and onto the witness stand under oath for the first time. Nichols says the police department caused him to lose his concealed weapon permit, which in turn cost him financing to manufacture the machine gun. During 4 days of frequently heated testimony last week, Nichols presented himself as a dashing, globe-trotting businessman and intelligence operative. Armed with letters on White House stationery and snapshots of himself posing with foreign political and military dignitaries, Nichols told jurors that he toiled quietly and selflessly for nearly 2 decades on behalf of shadowy CIA keepers in more than 30 nations from Central America to Southeast Asia. However, a far different portrait of Nichols was painted by Assistant City Attorney Robert Seaman, who's fighting to save the city from a major payout for damages. Seeking to portray Nichols as a phony, Seaman got Nichols to admit on the stand that he's not certain that the people who paid him for his intelligence work were employed by the CIA. Seaman also sought to discredit Nichols' stature as an entrepreneur by drawing out testimony that Nichols has never sold a gun nor made a penny of profit from his firm's business ventures. A CIA spokesman in a telephone interview wouldn't comment on whether Nichols was employed or affiliated with the agency. To buttress his client's credibility as a businessman, Nichols' lawyer introduced in court a flood of paper indicating that he'd worked on numerous ventures with prominent individuals. They included Robert A. Mayhew, Howard Hughes's former right-hand man, Michael A. McManus, an aide to President Ronald Reagan, Clint W. Murchison, then the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, and George K. Pender, an executive with a worldwide engineering company. Nichols testified about discussions he had with a White House aide on the rebuilding of Lebanon while he was affiliated with Meridian's predecessor firm, Santa Monica-based First Intercontinental Development Corp. That firm supposedly specialized in secret foreign construction projects for the U.S. government. On behalf of his company, Meridian International, he filed an $11 million damage suit alleging that Gates libeled the company and illegally interfered with potential business ventures. The suit alleges that Gates made slanderous statements to Australian law enforcement, accusing Meridian and its officers of involvement with organized crime and a stock swindle. Nichols cited a plethora of details about decade-old meetings with leaders of third world nations and aides to Ronald Reagan, but time and again he swore he had no recollection of how much he was paid for his intelligence or the names of those he worked for. Nichols also testified that he had no visible income for more than 15 years except for the living expenses he claimed he was receiving from his unnamed CIA keepers. It's worth noting here that on the concealed weapon permit application that was the basis of this lawsuit, Nichols listed residences in Italy, France, England, Australia, and the US, implying that his income during this period must have been substantial. Both lawsuits eventually came to naught. It was around this time, in the late 80s, that Nichols began his association with the journalist Danny Casolaro. According to Peter Zukoski, Casolaro had originally contacted him about the Octopus investigation, and it was Zukoski who introduced Casolaro to Nichols. In the weeks leading up to his death, Casolaro was spending hours on the phone with Nichols every week, often late into the night. At one point, shortly before his death, Nichols had flown from Puerto Rico to Washington, D.C. to meet with Casolaro, staying for several days. According to the FBI agent from the MCA investigation, Thomas Gates, it was after this visit that Nichols warned Casolaro, "If you continue this investigation, you will die." At the same time, Casolaro was also conducting prison interviews with Michael Riconosciuto, Nichols' former friend and business partner in the Wackenhut-Cabazon joint venture. After Riconosciuto's methamphetamine arrest, but before his trial, he was trying to trade information to the government for entrance into the Witness Protection Program. During one tape-recorded conversation with an FBI agent from this period, Riconosciuto claimed he had information that Nichols had personally bribed a DOJ lawyer named Mike Abel with $50,000 to stop the extradition of 3 Cali cartel leaders, Gilberto Rodriguez, Jose Londano, and Miguel Rodriguez. Quote, "Bob Nichols told me that it was necessary to crowbar the investigation because they were intelligence people. The FBI never took Riconosciuto up on the offer." Several years later, in 1995, 3 former federal prosecutors, including Mike Abel, were named in an indictment in Miami, along with 56 others, as part of a broad racketeering case against the Colombia-based Cali cartel. Jose Londano was charged in the same case. Abel and other lawyers faced charges of money laundering, drug conspiracy, and racketeering. The indictment charged them with obstruction of justice, preparing false affidavits, and conveying warnings to arrested cartel members that they shouldn't cooperate with government investigations. In the weeks preceding his death, Casolaro was regularly calling Nichols to get corroboration or further details on the things Riconosciuto was telling him. Riconosciuto claims that when he found out Casolaro had been asking around about Abel with Nichols and the DOJ, he started frantically trying to reach Casolaro, believing that he was putting himself in mortal danger. It was one of the last octopus leads that Casolaro ever chased. FBI agent Thomas Gates later told John Cohen, an investigator for the House Judiciary Committee on the Insul case, the FBI feels that Danny Casolaro's death was an ITAR murder, or interstate travel, in aid of racketeering. In other words, it was related to organized crime. If Nichols was involved in Casolaro's murder, no one has yet been able to prove it. In the early 90s, Robert Booth Nichols somehow ingratiated himself with the action movie star Steven Seagal, leading to a technical advisor role and bit acting part in Seagal's 1992 movie Under Siege. In the late 80s and early 90s, Nichols was also apparently associating with 2 monumental figures of modern American conspiracy mythology, Ted Gunderson and Bob Lazar. The conspiracy researcher Ken Thomas interviewed a man named Lars Hansen about the Octopus case for Steam Shovel Press, and Hansen had discovered that Nichols was in contact with Ted Gunderson at least as early as 1983. Gunderson was an FBI agent who was most notably head of the FBI's Los Angeles field office for a period in the 1970s and 80s. In fact, it appears that one of the FBI reports on Robert Booth Nichols was actually written by Ted Gunderson in his capacity as an FBI agent. After retiring from the Bureau, Gunderson gained public notoriety as a freelance private investigator and conspiracy theorist, working on Dr. Jeffrey McDonald's murder defense and the McMartin preschool case, while promoting New World Order and satanic cult-related conspiracy theories in the media. His association with Nichols was apparently personal as well as professional. For a period, Gunderson, Nichols, and Michael Riconosciuto had been inseparable, like the Three Musketeers. Gunderson said he and Riconosciuto had met with an arms dealer about supplying weapons for the Mujahideen in the Soviet-Afghan War, and that Riconosciuto had loaned him $60,000 for a joint business venture, which Gunderson never repaid. Spy magazine even obtained a transcript of a conversation between Gunderson, Riconosciuto, and an ex-CIA operative named Alan Boyack, in which Riconosciuto, quote, describes an occasion where Nichols wanted to deliver a message to a mobster from Chicago. He hung the man upside down on a hoist in an airplane hangar in front of a prop plane, then started the engine of the plane and revved it up, so the man hanging on the hoist was sucked towards the propellers. According to Riconosciuto, by the time Bob got finished with him, he wanted to die. In The Last Circle, Sherry Seymour says that the mobster from this story was actually a professional hitman named Sam Marowitz, and Gunderson was the one who tracked him down for Nichols. Gunderson even testified in Riconosciuto's defense at his methamphetamine trial and supplied Nichols with an affidavit for his lawsuit against FBI agent Thomas Gates. The connection with Bob Lazar seems to have been discovered by a writer named Tanner F. Boyle. Boyle was reading through notes written in 1998 by the UFO researcher and scientist Jacques Vallée, who was at that time running a technology investment fund, when, quote, on July 21, 1998, Jacques Vallée makes note of an interesting phone call. A strange character calls me every day, Vallée writes. He claims to have resided in the U.S. some 28 years. Working at Societe Generale in New York. He offered to invest money for our fund, placing it at surprisingly advantageous rates. But this generous proposal was, as Vallée put it, attached to all kinds of red flags. Indeed, it sounded too good to be true. He assured me he was an expert in currency stabilization, exploiting schemes through which the U.S. creates money by issuing securities below value and flipping them to leverage international intervention into currencies. He claims a few investors get into the deals at a huge profit, up to 50% per year. Rightfully sensing entrapment, Vallée declines, saying that his investors weren't looking to him to hedge their risks, only to achieve a fair return from straightforward technology investments, which is true. But the hook didn't end there, even if Vallée wasn't biting. The caller claimed further impressive contacts in Vallée's other wheelhouse, ufology. He said he was acquainted with Bob Lazar through a company run by a mutual friend named Bob Nichols. He went on to tell me that he knew a government agent in the military, higher than the Navy SEALs, who told him in confidence that all that stuff was real, meaning Lazar's claims about captured saucers. And in fact, there are photos of Robert Booth Nichols with Bob Lazar's close friend, the pilot and conspiracy theorist John Lear, with whom he appears to have had a long friendship dating back to at least the 1990s. For the unaware, Bob Lazar claims that he was employed as a scientist at the famous Area 51 Air Force installation in Nevada when he was tasked with reverse engineering alien technology that had been recovered by the U.S. government. John Lear, the son of the aviation magnate and namesake of the Learjet, Bill Lear, was an aviator and former CIA pilot who was deeply involved in the UFO conspiracy subculture of the 1980s and 90s, known for his associations with radio host and author Bill Cooper, Bob Lazar, and the infamous Paul Benowitz disinformation campaign. What does it mean that Nichols was associating with two of the most notable conspiracy mongers of the late 20th century? Well, at the very least, it shows that Nichols was likely knowledgeable enough about American conspiracy theories to give the impression of being in the know to a credulous observer. Whatever you think about Bob Lazar and Ted Gunderson, Nichols was associating with them in the 1980s and 90s, when conspiracy culture, for lack of a better term, was limited to small conventions, low circulation newsletters, and traded VHS tapes. It wasn't like you could just watch a documentary about Bob Lazar on Netflix. The conspiracy scene at that time was a tiny, fringe subculture, so the fact that Nichols was personally acquainted with two of its most prominent voices suggests that he was probably actively seeking out people from these circles to network with. And the idea of Nichols warning Danny Casolaro that his life was in danger from the shadowy forces he was investigating has a somewhat different connotation if Nichols was the kind of guy who also believed that the US government was covering up its reverse-engineered alien technology. But there's one more intersection with the wider conspiracy world that's worth mentioning here. In Sherry Seymour's book, The Last Circle, Seymour describes a 1992 meeting at Nichols' Sherman Oaks, California apartment building between herself, Robert Booth Nichols and his wife, Peter Zakowski and his wife, and a San Francisco Chronicle reporter named Jonathan Littman, the same meeting which is dramatized in the Netflix series American Conspiracy about the Octopus case. Nichols had agreed to meet with Seymour for an interview, apparently intending to suss out exactly what she knew about his past. But then, according to Seymour, at one point during our conversation, and completely out of context with what we were discussing, Nichols played a videotape of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The southern wall of Nichols' apartment contained a 6-foot-wide screen, on which I watched an enlarged, slow-motion, uncut version of the famous Zapruder film. I watched what appeared to be the standard media version of the film, seen so many times in film clips over the years. But then Nichols slowed down the camera even more, and on the 6-foot screen, I observed the driver of the limousine turn to his right, first looking at Connolly, then at Kennedy. The driver's left hand came over his right shoulder, and he was holding a long-barreled gun. Smoke and a bullet emerged from the gun, traveling ever so slowly across the screen into Kennedy's, blowing tissue into the air as he fell back against the seat. Stunned, I watched Jacqueline Kennedy open her mouth in horror as she glanced at the driver, then try to climb over the back seat of the car. Littman and Zakowski and I stared at the scene in silence, unable to believe what we were seeing. Nichols then changed the tape and showed what he described as the media version of the Zapruder tape. In the media version, the driver continued to drive, unflinching as the shots rang out. Then the scene switched to the back part of the limousine. At this point, Nichols stopped the frame and pointed with a stick at a tree in the background behind the limousine. From the middle of the tree to the ground, there was no trunk, just air. The top part of the tree was growing in air. I assumed the video had been tampered with. I asked Nichols where he'd obtained the original uncut version. He wouldn't say. I had no idea at that time that his Fidco partner, Clint Murchison Jr.'s father, had had instant access to the Zapruder film immediately after the assassination in Dallas. Nichols studied me for the longest time, then walked over to the window and lit a cigarette. He finally commented that the CIA can cover up anything at once, even a president's murder. He wanted to show me the power of the octopus. Nothing is as it appears to be, he said. So the Murchison family does figure into many of the conspiracy theories regarding the JFK assassination, but it's not clear how Seymour decided that Clint Murchison Sr. would have had instant access to the Zapruder film. The original film of the JFK assassination was purchased from Abraham Zapruder by Life magazine within 24 hours of the assassination, and there were no known copies made before the sale. Nichols told Seymour that the version of the Zapruder film released to the media had been doctored, and as proof, pointed to a seemingly edited tree without a trunk, which, he claimed, appears in the mass media version of the film. But copies of the Zapruder film are now easily available on demand in the highest possible resolution, and they don't contain this missing tree trunk. This meeting occurred in 1992, and Nichols probably just couldn't imagine how easily disprovable this story would be once the Zapruder film became widely accessible through high-speed internet and streaming video. The Oliver Stone movie, JFK, which features a central plot point revolving around painstaking analysis of a few frames of the Zapruder film, had been released in December of 1991, just months before this meeting took place.
Car breaks. The 6th and fatal shot, frame 313, takes Kennedy in the head from the front. This is the key shot. President going back and to his left. Shot from the front and right. Totally inconsistent with a shot from the depository. Again, back back, and to the left. Back, and to the left.
Stone's movie became a cultural phenomenon, generating so much interest in the assassination that it led directly to Congress's passage of the JFK Records Act, which mandated declassification of all JFK-related files in the government's possession. And Nichols had been working in the entertainment industry for MCA, trying to sell scripts he'd written to different Hollywood studios, and ingratiating himself with Steven Seagal and the people making the movie Under Siege in the months and years directly preceding the meeting with Seymour. So it's not inconceivable that he could have commissioned a special edit of the Zapruder film, or just came across an abandoned film project featuring the alternate assassination film footage, and then invented the backstory to fit the film clip. And moreover, there were dozens of first-hand witnesses and even other photographers witnessing and documenting the assassination, and yet none of them have ever claimed it was actually the driver who shot JFK. Jacqueline Kennedy was seated right next to her husband in the limousine. She certainly would have seen the driver turn around and fire a gun if that had happened. Was she participating in this cover-up? Was John Connally, the governor of Texas, who was also shot? Were the other Secret Service members in on it? And everyone in Dealey Plaza with a camera? The most likely answer here is that Robert Booth Nichols was intentionally weaving disinformation into the meeting with Sherry Seymour. According to Seymour, after they watched the Zapruder film, Nichols noted that he'd read my first book, the one I'd sent him, then handed me a book entitled The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. He told me to read it, appraising me silently. Inwardly, I recalled a conversation with Ted Gunderson's live-in partner, in which she related a conversation she'd had with Ted after a dinner engagement with Nichols. Nichols had reportedly stated to Ted that he headed a 200-man assassination team. Ted's partner had been too frightened to elaborate on this conversation, but had pointed out that Nichols once worked in the MKUltra program during the Vietnam War. This program was part of the Phoenix Project. Nichols' sister was allegedly a professional hypnotherapist, and Nichols himself was reportedly trained in the art of hypnotism. According to Riconosciuto, they all called themselves the Chosen Ones, wore skull and crossbones rings, and shared a common interest, if you could call it that, in the old German SS occultism. Of course, there's no hard evidence linking Nichols to MKUltra, the Phoenix program, or 200-man teams of assassins, and there's no evidence that MKUltra was part of the Phoenix program. But the public record is suffused with this kind of self-mythologizing from Nichols, and with Danny Casolaro's death in 1991, the mythology around Robert Booth Nichols began to take on a life of its own. There was early attention from figures aligned with Daniel Sheehan's Christic Institute and Lyndon LaRouche's Executive Intelligence Review. Independent conspiracy-oriented publications like Steam Shovel Press and Lobster Magazine started covering the Octopus case, and in 1993, Unsolved Mysteries released an episode featuring a segment on Danny Casolaro. Sherry Seymour began investigating the case in 1991, shortly after Casolaro's death, and by the year 2000, an early manuscript version of her book, The Last Circle, had begun circulating online. One of the people who read that manuscript was Sam Israel III, the founder and CEO of a Wall Street hedge fund called the Bayou Group. Israel was born into a family of wealthy commodities traders going back generations. He started working on Wall Street as a teenager, but rather than taking over the family business, Israel decided to strike out on his own, opening a hedge fund, which he named Bayou as a nod to his family's roots in New Orleans. By the mid-2000s, Bayou had about $450 million under management. Considered a boutique firm, the fund was run out of a small office with only a handful of employees and an exclusive list of clients, promising returns that far exceeded the market. Israel presented himself as a sort of stock trading savant, a slovenly, down-to-earth nerd who devised a computer program called forward propagation that could predict the market well enough to produce essentially risk-free profits. Most of the money was solicited from a small pool of high-net-worth individuals, including a few who bought in to diversify their portfolios after investing with Bernie Madoff's similarly positioned fund. But in reality, Sam Israel was cooking the books. He and another executive at the fund had been falsifying the numbers and producing fraudulent audits since Bayou began, and by the early 2000s, the fund was running as a Ponzi scheme, constantly needing to solicit new investors to pay off the old. But unlike most Ponzi schemers, Israel was always on the lookout for a way to turn the fund legitimate and start making money through actual investments in the market. The downside to Israel's optimism was that trying to trade his way out of the problem had only made it worse, and after a few bad quarters, Bayou was millions in the red, and the income from new customers was barely enough to keep the fund afloat. Then one day, in 2004, Israel's friend, the character actor Jack O'Halloran, told him, "There's a technology I've heard about that might be good for your trading system, but the guy who knows about it is really secretive. I shouldn't even be talking about him. He's very deep into CIA Black Ops." O'Halloran said the man's name was Robert Booth Nichols. He was a real-life Jason Bourne, a Black Ops national security asset who'd worked on the dark side of America's covert activities for decades. According to O'Halloran, Nichols was a stone-cold killer, an agent who functioned at the absolute highest levels of government. "Bob is a keeper of the secrets of the world," O'Halloran said. "He knows how the world really runs. That's the only reason he's still alive. Anything happens to Bob, the secrets get released." Sam turned on his computer and typed the name Robert Booth Nichols into his search engine. Hundreds of links appeared. Nichols was an internet celebrity, it appeared, his various operations turning him into a conspiracy theory superstar. There were references to the Octopus and multiple unsolved murders. Websites speculated about Nichols' ties to illegal black ops and organized crime. Sam clicked on a link to a book called The Last Circle. One of the central narratives of the Octopus case, and by extension The Last Circle by Sherry Seymour, revolved around a piece of software developed by the Inslaw Corporation in the 1980s called Promise. According to Guy Lawson, in the early 90s, Danny Casolaro had been reporting for a proposed book on the CIA's alleged theft of a computer program called Promise. The program had been developed a decade earlier by a company called Inslaw for the DOJ to turn the files of the federal court system into a searchable database. The program had been so successful that the American intelligence agency apparatus had secretly stolen the software to put it to use covertly. The CIA had reconfigured the code and installed it in 32-bit Digital Equipment Corporation DAX microcomputers. The agency had used front companies to sell the new technology to banks and leading financial institutions like the Federal Reserve. Hidden inside the computer was a trap door that enabled intelligence agencies to covertly monitor financial transactions digitally for the first time. The highly classified initiative, known as Follow the Money, had allowed the Reagan administration to trace the Libyan government's secret funding of a terrorist group that had bombed a disco in Berlin in 1986, killing an American soldier and wounding 200 civilians. In Bob Woodward's book Veil, former CIA Director William Casey said the secret money tracking system had been one of his proudest achievements. Sam Israel immediately saw the private sector applications for a program like Promise. If he had a back door into the computer systems of the Federal Reserve and international banks, he reasoned, then he could trace the flow of money all over the world and predict market movements minutes, hours, or even days before they happened. It would be like seeing into the future. Israel convinced Jack O'Halloran to introduce him to Robert Booth Nichols, the one man who he believed could actually track down Promise. Nichols insisted on a $25,000 fee up front just to take the meeting. Israel didn't want O'Halloran to know his true intentions regarding Promise, so the meeting was set for London under the pretense of soliciting Nichols' expertise on some financial security technology for a company that Israel and O'Halloran were involved in. Once there, Israel convinced Nichols to break away from the others for a private conversation. Nichols was talking on his cell phone. He gestured that the call would take a minute. Israel noticed Nichols was holding a piece of paper with numbers and columns. Sam could hear the voice on the other end, but he couldn't understand what they were discussing. Nichols hung up. He quickly returned the piece of paper to his briefcase. "I want Promise," Israel said, too impatient to wait to speak. "I know you're involved in the computer program. I know about you, and I want Promise." "Why should I give it to you?" Nichols asked. "I'll pay for it," Israel said. "I don't give a shit. I'll do whatever it takes." "What do you want it for?" "To trade with," Israel said. "I run a hedge fund. I'll be able to keep track of the market. I'll be able to watch how the Federal Reserve is moving money and trade ahead. Volume precedes price." "Who are you?" Nichols asked. "I run a fund called Bayou," Israel said. "I'm a trader." "No, I mean, who are you?" Nichols asked. "Are you affiliated with an intelligence agency? How long have you been on Wall Street? Who are your relatives? What are your ties?" Nichols' cell phone rang. He took the call, speaking in a low voice to avoid Israel overhearing what he was saying. After Nichols hung up, another call came in, and he again talked in a hush. Israel was able to make out the words payout and the program, but not the substance of the conversation. When Nichols hung up, Israel asked what he'd been talking about. Nichols was reluctant to say. All he would reveal was that he was doing business with a prince from Saudi Arabia, business that involved a trading program. Nichols' cell rang yet again. This time, as Nichols spoke, he opened his briefcase to retrieve the document he'd consulted earlier. For a split second, Sam caught sight of the columns of numbers. "What is that?" Israel asked. Reluctantly, Nichols clicked open his briefcase and handed over the document. "It's a payout sheet from a trading program." Israel looked at the figures on the page. On the left were numbers arranged to show amounts of money invested, figures in the low millions. On the right side was a column displaying the profits made. The returns were astronomical. An investment of $5 million in the trading program became $20 million in a matter of days. There was no indication of what was being traded or where, but the results were astounding. "These are the returns?" Israel asked, incredulous. "I'm doing this with the Saudis right now," Nichols said. "What are you trading?" "Bonds," Nichols said. "But it's very difficult to get into this market. Nearly impossible." "What market?" "High-yield buy-sell trading programs," Nichols said. "The market's only open to the biggest players." "So how do I get in?" Israel asked. "I know how to trade anything." "Do you have $100 million in cash?" Nichols asked. It seemed to Israel that Nichols had tossed out this huge number as a way to brush him off. But Israel wasn't deterred. He leaned forward. "I do," said Israel. "I've got $100 million in cash." "Do you have $150 million?" Nichols asked. "Yes." "Do you have $200 million?" "That's pushing it," Israel said. "You should forget about promise," Nichols said. "I know how to put your money to work. I know how to make you a lot of money." Nichols explained how the secret bond market functioned. According to Nichols, the basic institutions of the modern world, the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve, the IMF, were all a front. "There's a secret government operating within the world's government," Nichols said to Sam. "They run the secret trading program, the high-yield market. Only a few chosen people participate in the program. The returns are staggering. The proceeds are used to fund black operations, wars, to pay off foreign governments. The proceeds are also used for good works in the third world, to build hospitals, construct water treatment plants, cure diseases. It's the way order's maintained in the world. The programs are top secret, highly, highly classified. Getting approved to trade in the market is extremely difficult. I don't know if I can do it, but I know people who can give you a shot at getting in." Nichols said the Saudi prince he'd been talking to in the taxi was trading medium-term notes, or MTNs. But Nichols said the Saudi wasn't paying him properly. All he was getting was a small finder's fee, not the proper commission he was supposed to be paid for facilitating entry to the market. Nichols said he was tired of being taken advantage of by his clients. He was more than a simple broker. He was a guide for the treacherous trek into the shadow market. Nichols said he had the ability to lead Sam into the labyrinth of what he called the upper world. "Bob told me how the market really worked," Sam recalled. "The treasury bonds of the United States were supposedly created at the Federal Reserve. That was the public story. The bonds were issued at a discount, 88% say. The Fed then sold the bonds to their few select banks, primary dealers they were called. Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, Nomura, Union Bank of Switzerland, BNP Paribas. The largest financial institutions in the world had access to the pre-market for the Fed's notes. The prime dealers were given a discount to incentivize them to buy the notes. The rates varied, but they usually got a discount of a couple of points. Their returns were basically guaranteed and riskless. The prime dealers were the insiders who got the sweetheart deal. The big banks then put the bonds on the market, priced at 93, 94%, and those were bought up by the little shitbox dealers, TD Waterhouse and Ameritrade. The bonds were marked up 1% or more. That was when John Q. Public got to buy Federal Reserve notes, after the banks had taken their slice of the pie at no risk. That was the known market. People think the Federal Reserve is run by the federal government, but it isn't. The Federal Reserve is a private company owned by the banks. It's a club. That's why everything it does is so secret. Everything's behind closed doors. The public doesn't know who really runs the Fed or who owns the Fed. Bob said that if you understand the powers behind the Federal Reserve, you can see who's really running the world. Money makes the world go round after all. The reality, Bob said, is that the U.S. government is bankrupt. When Nixon took America off the gold standard in 1972, the shit hit the fan. There wasn't enough gold in the Federal Reserve to pay for all the dollars that had been issued by the government. So America just changed the system. That was what created the so-called fiat currency. The American dollar isn't worth the paper it's printed on. I knew Bob was right. I'm never wrong about this kind of thing. This was the stuff I knew, the stuff I'd been taught by the Wall Street traders my dad knew in the 80s, the real masters of the universe. I'd grown up watching how things were manipulated. This was where the secret bond market came in, Bob said. To keep the system solvent, the Fed secretly issued notes at a huge discount, under 50 cents on the dollar. The notes were then traded in the shadow market. The major banks had special departments that did this kind of trading. The margins were huge. The sums were huge, billions upon billions. But the public wasn't told about the market because if it became known how flimsy the global economic system really is, there'd be a huge panic. Bob said there was a catch. If you traded into this market, you weren't allowed to keep all the profits. If I managed to get into the market, which was a big if, Bob said I'd be able to keep a cut, maybe 20%, maybe 10%. It depended on the structure of the deal. The rest would go to charities approved by the ruling families. The money would be spent curing AIDS in Africa or building water treatment plants in Pakistan. That was how the system worked, how the world financial system really functioned. I didn't understand everything Bob said at first, but the core of what he was saying made sense. I knew the Fed was fixing the stock market. All the quantitative easing the Fed did was just to drive up the S&P to keep the little people happy and not asking difficult questions. I told Bob I wanted to learn more. If what Bob was saying was true, the implications for me were amazing. If I was going to get into the shadow market, I knew that I was going to have to stay in London to make the trades. Bob said he was going to stick close to me. From that day forward, we were together constantly. He was my handler. That was his word for it. From then on, he was going to handle me. Years later, Sam Israel would detail his journey into the secret market in a series of interviews with the journalist Guy Lawson. For his book, Octopus, Sam Israel, The Secret Market, and Wall Street's Wildest Con, Nichols negotiated for himself a fee amounting to 5% of any profits Israel made from his trades on the secret market. All that remained was for Israel to meet the designated trader who'd been assigned to the newly minted faction. Emily Hardwick was blonde, 5'4", in her early 40s. Nichols said she was an expert in the programs. Hardwick spoke with an upper-class English accent and dressed in conservative business attire. To Israel, it was evident that she was well-versed in the bonds. Hardwick explained her ground rules. She didn't want her real name disclosed under any circumstances. She wouldn't allow any photographs of her to be taken. Secrecy was paramount. On April 14, 2004, Bayou wired $150 million to an account at Barclays in London. Under the terms of the agreement with Nichols, Israel was now called the benefactor. Israel believed he'd read the terms carefully, though he never managed to explain to Lawson precisely how the bond market was supposed to work, or where the profits were meant to come from. The parties agree that the financial return to the benefactor shall be 100%, paid every 10 days. Investing in the high-yield market was financially risk-free, Nichols had explained, but just attempting to trade in it meant that Israel risked being killed at any moment by a rival faction angling for control over the lucrative bonds. At midnight, Israel, Nichols, and Hardwick went to the offices of Barclays Bank at 54 Lombard Street in London's financial district. Nichols accompanied Sam as bodyguard, minority partner, and handler. Despite the late hour, the trio had to pass through security. Upstairs, there was a large trading room with 30 or 40 desks. The room was empty and the computers were turned off. They walked through to another room in the back. This was the secret shadow market trading room, with high ceilings and dark wood furniture and the formal decorations of a boardroom. On one wall, there was a bank of screens. Bonds were stacked on a desk, embossed and sealed and stamped documents with the U.S. Federal Reserve mark. Israel paged through the financial instruments. They appeared legitimate. Nichols pointed out the QSIP numbers, the 10-digit security identification given to securities, and Sam concluded they were real. "We were given a trading desk," Sam said. "There was a computer on the desk showing how regular bonds were trading in the overnight markets. Then there was another computer showing where these other bonds were trading." Emily Hardwick was a standalone trader. She'd been trading with the Fed for years. She was a secret squirrel. She didn't want to be known in any way. So Emily and I started to bid on the bonds. We were the only ones in the room, but I could see the other traders on the screen. The German bank Postbank was trading, HSBC, Mellon. There were 16 or 17 banks approved to do these trades. They were the night traders, not because it was done at night, though it was. They were night traders because the business was invisible. No one on the outside could see what was going on. Emily introduced me online as a new night trader. I was trading for my own program, for my $150 million. It was like regular trading. There was a quote, a bid, an ask. The denominations ran up to billions. I was just a little guy in this market, but I was buying and selling. Prices were moving from 44 points to 50 points. Because of the spreads, there was a lot of room to trade. Bob was with me in the room. He never left my side. At dawn, trading ceased. Sam retired, exhausted, to his hotel room. He was pleased to be started on the new market, but he was impatient to see tangible results, actual profits that he could send back to Bayou. The pace of night trading in the program bonds was slow. Trading took place only every third or fourth night. Sam wanted to hurry up, but Hardwick insisted on patience. Under the agreement, Hardwick was required to give a weekly report on their trading activity. On April 29, 1 week after Hardwick began trading, the profits from the trading program had reached $942 million. That meant that after paying Nichols and Emily Hardwick and making the charitable donation required to participate in the shadow market, Israel would walk away with almost $500 million in profit, more than enough to resurrect Bayou in just 1 week of trading. But after a few days passed and the funds still weren't delivered, Israel checked his London account. The initial $150 million investment had been returned. Emily Hardwick had disappeared, taking the $500 million in profit with her and leaving the original buy-in capital sitting in Israel's account. It was the perfect crime. What was Israel going to do? Call the cops? But Nichols told Sam they could still find a way to trade in the secret market. With Hardwick out of the picture, Nichols suggested that Israel could do the trades by himself. The trading he'd done earlier had been under Hardwick's authority as a veteran of the secret market. But Nichols believed that Sam could qualify to become the designated trader for their faction. But then, weeks continued to pass, and not a single trade came to fruition. Nichols said that the trading schedule for the shadow market was limited, but reassured Sam that his opportunity would come soon. They continued traveling around Europe, chasing down leads on where they could buy into the secret market, but each time they got close, their plans were thwarted. Nichols continually impressed upon Israel how dangerous participating in the shadow market was. There were competing factions constantly fighting for access to increase their market share and to prevent newcomers from joining, using whatever means necessary, up to and including murder. When you were trading, there were a lot of people coming after you, Israel said. Other factions were trying to stop me from trading. The other factions were pursuing their own agendas. There were groups who used cutout corporations to funnel cash to the Taliban, for example. There were factions who were not friendly to the United States. The program wasn't only for the United States. It was a global trading program. The undertaking was very secretive. The different groups were funding black ops or covert government projects. The danger would arise if we were found out to be making the trades. I couldn't divulge the existence of the program to anyone, and that meant anyone. It shrouded the whole process in an atmosphere of danger and paranoia that was constantly being reinforced by Nichols. They needed to be mindful of their surroundings. One day, while walking to a scheduled meeting with Nichols, Israel noticed he was being followed. He had to run down an alley and jump a fence to escape the assailant. Nichols, who remained armed at all times, even in London and other European capitals, convinced Israel that it was time that he, too, start carrying a gun. While waiting for another chance to buy into the shadow market, Nichols told Israel about another financial secret that was known only to the power elite. In the early 1930s, on the eve of the Second World War, the Roosevelt administration had enacted a secret policy of funding and arming America's allies through back channels, well before America or even Britain declared war. One of these allies, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of Kuomintang, China, had been fighting the Japanese in Manchuria, as well as the communist rebels of Mao Zedong. Legend has it that FDR secretly provided billions of dollars worth of Federal Reserve bonds to Chiang Kai-shek in 1934 to enable arms purchases. When the Chinese lost the war to the Japanese, the nation's then capital was overrun and plundered, an event known to history as the Rape of Nanking. The Japanese stole billions in precious metals, jewels, artwork, and gold bullion, and secretly shipped it to their outpost in the Philippines. By the time Americans were threatening to retake the Philippines in 1944, it was too late to transport it all back to Japan, so the Japanese government ordered a general named Yamashita to create a network of caves high in the jungle on the island of Mindanao to hide the loot. Stacks of gold bars and a mother box containing 25 smaller boxes containing billions of dollars worth of secretly issued American Federal Reserve bonds were placed in the caves. When construction was finished, all the Japanese soldiers who had worked on the project gathered in one of the tunnels to celebrate. At midnight, General Yamashita quietly excused himself and dynamited the entrance to the caves, burying hundreds of men alive, ensuring that the location of the treasure would remain secret. The hunt for Yamashita's gold had been going on ever since. For decades, soldiers of fortune had traveled to the island of Mindanao in search of the treasure. Major General John Singlaub, a founder of the CIA, and the officer who headed the intelligence operations in China during the war in Manchuria, had led one such expedition. According to Nichols, many men had been murdered trying to retrieve Yamashita's gold, but the descendants of Chiang Kai-shek were in possession of one of the boxes containing the Fed bonds. Nichols said he could broker the return of the bonds to the United States in return for a percentage of the face value. Bob showed me photographs of the boxes containing the Federal Reserve certificates, Sam recalled. There was a picture of a rusty old briefcase with the seal of the Fed on the front. It was one of 25 boxes that all fit together into the mother box. There were photographs of Asian men standing around a table, the emissaries of the family of Chiang Kai-shek. There was a picture of a canister that contained a deadly nerve gas. If the boxes weren't opened at a 45-degree angle, the canisters would explode and kill whoever tried to get at the Fed bonds. Those were the real boxes, but Bob said there were many counterfeits in circulation. He showed me photographs of the fakes, which were in Samsonite suitcases. He explained how to tell the difference between the real ones and the phony ones. More than $700 billion in bonds had been issued. Nichols said that if the Fed paid even a fraction of the true value of the bonds, it would amount to tens of millions. The Federal Reserve denies the legitimacy of the bonds, Nichols told Sam. They say the bonds are counterfeit. They say the Fed never issued the bonds. They mythify them to create plausible deniability. The Fed knows it doesn't have enough money to pay for the bonds, so it pretends that the bonds were never issued. The only way to repatriate the bonds is to have contacts at the absolute highest levels of the United States government. That means the White House. That means the Bush family. They're at the level to know about the Fed obligations. The first cousin of President Bush is one of my best friends, Sam said. His name's John Ellis. He's tight with the president. I can arrange for you to meet John. I need to know that Ellis has relationships at the correct level, or else it's in no one's interest to pursue this, Nichols said. Not for you, not for the Chinese, not for me. Israel set up a meeting for Nichols with George W. Bush's cousin, John Ellis. After hearing Nichols' story, Ellis initially thought it was nonsense, but decided to ask around with his contacts in the senior ranks of the Pentagon and the intelligence world anyway, as a favor to Israel. It turned out that Nichols was known to some of the soldiers as a kind of mythical figure in the world of black ops. All hat and no cattle was one reply. Crazy, said another. Brigadier General Russ Howard, former head of the Special Forces A-Team, the real one, told Ellis that he'd heard the legend of the Fed bonds in the Philippines, but actually going after them sounded like a wild goose chase. Ellis contacted Fred Fielding, White House counsel for both Presidents Reagan and George W. Bush. Fielding was one of the premier Republican attorneys and deal-makers in Washington. Fielding agreed to ask around. Within days, he reported that the word he'd received on Nichols was simple: stay away, far, far away. The projects Nichols was discussing might be illegal, Fielding said. He told Ellis not to discuss them with anyone and not to get involved in any way. It was the response Ellis expected, though inflicted with a degree of intrigue he hadn't anticipated. Nichols apparently did have special ops experience and connections inside the White House, but the nature of his relationships wasn't clear. Nichols appeared to be two things at the same time: a former intelligence operative of some kind and a scammer peddling financial frauds. He was a spy and a con artist, or he was a spook who'd become a confidence man. During the Cold War, the lines between real intelligence operatives and frauds had blurred badly. The U.S. government had hired countless contractors to carry out its dirty work. Nichols had apparently been one of those men. In the meantime, Nichols had finally tracked down a new access point for the secret market through Postbank in Hamburg, Germany. Following Nichols' instructions, Israel flew to Hamburg, rendezvousing first with a man he was told was Pakistani intelligence, and given a bag containing two 9mm Beretta handguns, each equipped with a silencer. Nichols arrived the next morning in full Black Ops mode. Hundreds of operatives had descended on Hamburg to try to stop them from making a trade, Nichols told Israel, and urban combat was highly likely. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning, a short walk from the hotel. As Israel and Nichols cautiously made their way, the streets of Hamburg seemed eerily empty. Israel and Nichols were greeted by a German banker at the rear entrance to a nondescript brown brick building and ushered through the back door and into the lobby, completely deserted aside from 2 cleaners vacuuming. In an office, the banker explained that the transaction involved $2 billion in medium-term note prime bank debentures. The instruments were seasoned, he said, meaning they'd been traded already. To perform the final step of due diligence, Nichols borrowed a phone to call Phil Sievert, this is a pseudonym given by Guy Lawson, who Nichols claimed was a former Reagan official and a member of the Trilateral Commission, who would be responsible for the charitable component of the trade, a water treatment facility outside Karachi, Pakistan. Israel had talked to Sievert once before. It was a conversation that had made a strong impression on him. When we spoke, Sievert repeatedly told me he had what he called a stupid face, Israel recalls. He said he had the kind of face that was instantly forgettable. He could vanish into crowds. He said he was invisible because his face was so average, so stupid. Sievert assured the men that the Karachi initiative was in place. All that remained was for Israel to transfer $120 million to a non-depletion account in Postbank. For security purposes, Israel left the meeting ahead of Nichols, walking out the back door. Across the street, there was a man standing next to a telephone pole, Israel remembers. He was short, maybe 5'5", wearing a turban. He appeared to be Pakistani. One of his eyes drooped down. He started to walk toward me. As I got near him, he passed by, and he said, I swear to God, he said, "You have a really smart face." I stopped dead. I knew it was Sievert telling me he'd sent people to watch us in Hamburg. So I threw the guy against the wall and asked what the f*** was going on. He wouldn't talk to me, not in English. All of a sudden, he could only speak Urdu. He kept saying the same thing. No, Sahib, no, Sahib. I let him go. I walked a couple more steps, and then I turned around to see if Nichols was behind me. As I turned, I saw the guy reach into his pocket and pull out a gun. Now Nichols was coming out of the building. The guy was taking aim to shoot Nichols. I pulled my Beretta out and I shot at the guy. I hit him in the left hip. Everything was moving in slow motion. The guy dropped the gun and fell to the ground. By that time, Nichols had pulled out his gun and he plugged the guy in the right shoulder. I walked over and shot him in the head, point blank, killing him. His head exploded all over the sidewalk. Blood and brains were everywhere. There were no cars, no witnesses, nobody was there. The silencers worked, so the shots didn't make any sound. No one had seen what happened. Bob grabbed me and took the gun from my hand, and we ran for our lives. When we got back to the hotel, I didn't know what to do. We went to Bob's room. I was crying. I was devastated. I threw up. Bob said I was the craziest person he'd ever met, but I'd saved his life. He told me he'd take care of it. Bob started to make calls. He got rid of the body. He had cleaners to take care of that kind of thing, to make a body disappear before the police were alerted. He got rid of the guns, too. He made it so there were no traces of the crime. So, for context, Israel was telling this story to the journalist Guy Lawson from his federal prison cell years later, after having been convicted of crimes related to the Bayou Ponzi scheme. But Lawson has always maintained that Sam Israel seems to genuinely believe that he actually killed a man that day in Hamburg, and Robert Booth Nichols successfully covered it up. There was no chance he faked it on me. It wasn't a Hollywood setup. The guy's left hip was bleeding profusely. His brains were sprayed all over the pavement. This was the real thing. I had nightmares about the scene for months. I would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. Bob told me to never mention it again, to not tell a soul. I haven't, until now. Lawson seems to accept that Israel is relating real events as they actually happened from his perspective, but Lawson thinks the whole scene was staged by Nichols as part of a long con. Nichols provided the gun and the bullets. Nichols facilitated the stupid face conversation with Phil Sievert. Nichols made sure Israel was on that street in Hamburg at that time, on that day, and so on. But according to Lawson, Sam Israel is utterly convinced to this day that he really shot and killed the man in the turban. Of course, buying into the market in Hamburg was now out of the question. Israel had just shot a man in the middle of the city's financial district, and now he needed to flee the country. But Nichols had another way to make money. Nichols said he hadn't told Israel the whole truth about the secret Federal Reserve bonds hidden in caves in the Philippines. Nichols actually already had one of the boxes containing $100 million in Fed bonds stored in a bank vault in London. Israel could buy the box for $10 million. Even if the U.S. government would only pay half the face value, he'd still be quintupling his money at least. Israel accepted on one condition. He wanted to see the copy of the Zapruder film that Nichols had shown to Sherry Seymour. Nichols agreed, and they watched the tape together in Israel's London hotel room. It was exactly as Seymour had described, with the driver taking the fatal shot and the missing tree trunk. Nichols explained that Jackie Kennedy actually had seen the whole thing, but she'd been told that if she ever talked, her children would be killed. The next morning, Nichols and Israel went to the London Safe Deposit Company. Taking an elevator to a sub-basement through a long corridor, they came to a door with a retina scanner next to it. Nichols put his chin on the platform in front of the lens, and his eyeball was digitally scanned. The door opened, and down another flight of stairs, they finally reached the vault. Nichols opened the door to his safe deposit box and pulled an antique brown leather and metal box from it. Roughly the dimensions of a briefcase and covered in rust, it had a seal on the front, Federal Reserve of the United States, in the same font as the American dollar, exactly like the briefcases Israel had seen in the photos Nichols showed him. Nichols said he'd obtained the box from a Swiss intelligence operative who'd been selling the boxes on behalf of their owners, Chiang Kai-shek's exiled descendants. Israel remembered that the box was booby-trapped with nerve gas and couldn't be opened safely inside a bank vault, but the box's contents were too valuable to be carried around on the streets of London. Israel paid for a safe deposit box near the one Nichols owned and stashed the box there, then wired Nichols the $10 million. But by this time, the Bayou Fund Ponzi scheme was unraveling. The frequent transfer of over $150 million into different accounts across Europe and the US set off alarm bells at the banks. They thought Israel was laundering money and froze his accounts, which caught the attention of the FBI. Perhaps worried about law enforcement attention, or maybe just satisfied with the $10 million payout, Nichols started looking for a way to extricate himself from the situation. "We had a big blow-up," Israel said. "It seemed contrived to me, like he was deliberately picking a fight. All of a sudden, he didn't want to be involved anymore. He didn't want to talk to me. It all came apart very quickly." With Israel busy chasing the secret market all over Europe, things had deteriorated at Bayou, and customers began demanding to withdraw funds that were now frozen in Sam Israel's European bank accounts. When Bayou couldn't pay out, customers started filing complaints with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, or CFTC. By late September of 2005, the CFTC filed charges against Bayou, Sam Israel, and the executive who'd been helping Israel falsify the fund's numbers. Within a year, Bayou filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Israel began meeting with U.S. attorneys for the Southern District of New York with his defense lawyers, trying to work out a deal. He told them about Robert Booth Nichols, the secret market, and the Chinese Federal Reserve notes worth $100 million. The FBI retrieved the Fed bonds from Israel's safe deposit box and called in officials from the Federal Reserve to inspect them. The quality of the paper seemed authentic. The bonds were composed of the same material Crane & Co. had supplied the Federal Reserve for generations. The coupons for the bond were payable over 30 years at 4% interest, not an unusual structure in 1934. The signature of Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau was authentic, and Morgenthau was a close personal friend of FDR who had been charged with conducting covert economic diplomacy for the United States before World War II. According to leading historians, it was entirely possible that the U.S. government had secretly funded the Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek in ways that remained classified secrets. After the communists took over China in 1949, there was no sovereign to claim ownership of the bonds. On their face, the bonds appeared to be what Nichols maintained, valid obligations of the Federal Reserve. The debt had been swept away by the sands of history, but there were oddities. There were grammatical errors, as if the words had been written in broken English. There were misspellings as well. The Federal Reserve claimed that they'd never issued bonds. They issued only notes. It was like saying the U.S. government had issued pounds or euros instead of dollars. The Fed said that the government seal on the box wasn't from the Fed. It was the State Department's version of the seal. Then there was the matter of denominations. Nichols had told Sam that the Fed notes inside the box were worth $100 million, but there were 25 notes in the box. Each of the bonds had a stated face value of $100 million. That meant the total value was $2.5 billion. Either Sam Israel had pulled off one of the greatest trades in recorded human history with a rate of return of 2,500%, or he'd been conned. The U.S. Attorney's Office in New York sued Nichols for the return of the $10 million he'd received from Israel for the Fed bonds. But incredibly, despite the paper trail of wire transfers, plus testimony from Sam Israel and even Nichols himself, they never charged Nichols with fraud, conspiracy, tax evasion, or any other crime. According to Lawson, by the terms of a previous agreement, the proceedings against Nichols were to remain under seal for reasons that weren't explained. Nichols' name wouldn't be released to the press, nor would any evidence of his long and mysterious association with the intelligence apparatus of the U.S. government. Questions at the deposition would be asked only by federal attorneys, once again with no explanation offered. And when court documents from the cases were released to the media and uploaded to public government databases, entire sections were redacted, including the exhibits showing the supposedly fake Federal Reserve bonds. But Sam Israel wouldn't be as lucky. In 2008, he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $300 million in restitution. He faked his own death and disappeared for a few weeks, but ultimately turned himself in and received an additional 2 years for absconding. Israel was sent to FCC Butner in North Carolina, the same prison as Bernie Madoff. A few months after Israel pled guilty, the 2008 economic crisis hit. Ironically, if Bayou's customers had never tried to withdraw their money, by the time the market crashed in September of 2008, the Bayou Fund would have outperformed the S&P. Robert Booth Nichols negotiated an agreement with the federal government where he was to surrender $5 million in cash by February of 2009. That month, Nichols was in Switzerland with another Wall Street banker with whom he was supposedly working on a water treatment project to be built in Alabama. But according to the Swiss government, within a few weeks of the date his restitution was due, Nichols died of a heart attack in his 5-star hotel room. Some people who are close to him contend that he's still alive, said Sherry Seymour, the author of The Last Circle. They say he's living in Liechtenstein, or Cambodia, or Bali. I haven't drawn any conclusions, one way or the other. Sam Israel had no doubt that Nichols was still alive, probably in Vietnam. He had bank accounts all over the world, countless fake identities. It'd be impossible to catch him. Bob isn't dead, Israel told Guy Lawson. He's very much alive and well, somewhere. Bob's the real thing, not a con man like the government says. There's too much smoke for there to be no fire. He's literally the man who doesn't exist. He told me that many times. He left no footprint. Bob was seriously connected to American intelligence agencies and the people who really run the world, to the Octopus. How else can it be explained that he was never charged with a crime? If you believe in the shadow government, as I do, there have to be people like Bob alive in the world. Think about Iran-Contra. Think about Iraq and the supposed weapons of mass destruction and how the public swallows all the bullshit fed to them by the government, like the death of Osama bin Laden. Bob told me about the Corps Command and the Pakistani generals and how they all knew exactly where bin Laden was hiding. That was years before bin Laden was killed, inside a compound right next to a major Pakistani military base. The truth was just like Bob described it. I sometimes think Bob was the only real person I met. It's worth pointing out that the description of the secret market Nichols was trying to shepherd Sam Israel into is virtually identical to something called a prime bank investment scam. According to Guy Lawson, by the time Sam Israel met Robert Booth Nichols in 2004, more than $10 billion had been lost to high-yield fraud, according to the best estimates. Countless billions have been lost since, despite warnings from the SEC, the IMF, the World Bank, and the International Chamber of Commerce. There were endless variations to the scams, but the themes were common. All claimed securities were issued at deep discounts for the lucky few able to make the trades. Medium-term notes, zero bonds, debentures, all the structures promised to double or triple the investor's money in a matter of weeks. The best marketing tool was the corrupt institutions propping up American capitalism, the bankruptcy of the Federal Reserve, the duplicity of Wall Street, the machinations of the federal government as it created a new world order. But then again, if the whole thing was fake, then what was the secret trading floor at Barclays Bank in the London financial district? Had Nichols set that up too? Lawson believes that the events really happened as Israel describes, but says that Barclays was actually in the process of moving offices at that time, and suggests Nichols or Hardwick must have bribed a security guard to play along with the con. But then who were the other traders Israel was talking to that night, and how did Hardwick get access to Barclays' computers? And besides, the bulk of the evidence seems to suggest that Robert Booth Nichols actually believed in the existence of the secret market. In fact, after Nichols deposited the $10 million Israel paid him into a London bank account, Nichols' account was frozen, and he was interviewed by a veteran detective from the serious fraud office there named Michael Manley, under suspicion of fraud and money laundering. But the detective concluded that, if anything, Nichols had been a victim of fraud, not a perpetrator. It was obvious to Detective Inspector Manley that Nichols believed in the existence of the secret shadow market. There was no question that Nichols had been conned as well, said Manley. Fraudsters often believe in their own fantasy world. Nichols fit the profile of many of our victims, and so did Sam Israel. Greed was the motivation. Neither of them was using his own money in the first place. All they were thinking about was the huge returns. There was no reason to believe that Nichols was running the prime bank scam. And even though the story of the secret Federal Reserve notes from Chiang Kai-shek's China is shrouded in myth, there are legitimate historical reasons to believe that such bonds did exist. The U.S. government insisted that the Federal Reserve bonds they found in Sam Israel's safe deposit box were fraudulent, but they refused to return the bonds to his possession, or even release photos showing what the bonds looked like. Whoever made them somehow got access to the exact kind of paper the Fed was using at that time, and perfectly forged the signature of then Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. On the other hand, the box that the bonds were stored in also contained obviously fake legal documents written in broken English, and forgery of these bonds is so common that the U.S. Treasury Department has a section on their website warning about fakes. In fact, just a few years after Sam Israel was arrested, 2 Japanese men were caught trying to enter Switzerland with $130 billion worth of fake treasury bonds that were very similar to the ones described in Israel's charging documents. The fakes are so common, the Treasury even has a name for them, Morgenthau's, after Henry Morgenthau, whose forged signature usually appears on the fake notes. But even if we suppose that the bonds Israel purchased were genuine, would the federal government really honor what were essentially wartime IOUs from 70 years earlier? Robert Booth Nichols seemed to believe that the U.S. government would only pay out on the bonds if the beneficiary was a member of the old money aristocracy of the American ruling class, which was why he tried to enlist George W. Bush's cousin, John Ellis, in the scheme. If anything, Robert Booth Nichols was acting as if he really believed in the conspiracy theories he was telling Sam Israel, where the power elite received privileges from the American government that were kept secret from everyone else. What does it mean that Robert Booth Nichols, the CIA super spy, genuinely believed in these unproven and likely false conspiracy theories? Had the years he spent working for Reagan's National Security Council predisposed him to believing the darkest, most cynical theories about the American government? Or was he just a credulous, unsophisticated idiot who BS'd his way into the halls of power? Nichols was certainly a liar, seeding his autobiography with fantastical tales of MK Ultra, the Phoenix program, and 200-man hit teams. But he was also getting tipped off to federal investigations from inside the DOJ and meeting with Contra Army officials to conduct the most highly classified covert diplomacy of the Reagan era. The federal prosecutors who investigated Nichols discovered that he'd at least offered to become an informant for the DOJ, and they believed some of the departments may have taken him up on it, despite their denials. Guy Lawson says that Nichols fell out with the national security state in the wake of Iran-Contra, but the FBI suspected that Nichols' association with MCA, which occurred after the Iran-Contra scandal broke, may have been an intelligence front, where Nichols was using MCA branch offices around the world as cover, suggesting that his relationship with the CIA may have lasted longer than Lawson realized. And Nichols' association with organized crime fits a long, established pattern of American intelligence agencies coordinating with the mafia to achieve shared objectives. The CIA famously recruited American mobsters like Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli for attempts on Fidel Castro's life, in exchange for promises to return the mob's casinos and other property in a post-Castro Cuba. And the infamous French Connection heroin trafficking scheme only existed because the CIA backed mafia takeovers of European shipping ports after the Second World War to sabotage the left-wing dockworker unions. Sherry Seymour characterized Nichols as the interface between the worlds of American intelligence agencies and organized crime, but with Nichols, the line between these two worlds was only slightly blurrier than normal. According to Nichols, he learned how to launder money in Switzerland as a means of financing CIA black ops, and he appears to have just taken those same skills to the private sector. Even the FBI had to acknowledge that Nichols' earliest associations with organized crime were through Harold Okamoto, a man who seemed to have long-standing ties to a deputy director of the CIA, Frank Carlucci. On the other hand, Guy Lawson's interpretation, where Nichols was just a criminal and a con man, skillfully constructing false realities for his victims like Sam Israel, doesn't explain his connections at the very top of the American power structure, in intelligence, the military, civilian government, and the military-industrial complex. Lawson's version of events, where Nichols was setting up fake stock trading rooms and fake shootouts just to string Sam Israel along, sounds plausible until you realize it would have required Nichols to rent entire buildings and enlist scores of bit players and background extras to participate in the fake world he created. This is not to say that the secret market, as Nichols described it, was real, but Lawson glosses over the hardest questions of what exactly was going on between Nichols and Sam Israel, and a straightforward con game would have been orders of magnitude more complex and expensive to pull off than Lawson lets on. And it seems virtually certain that Nichols had some kind of special legal protection from the U.S. government, which lasted for decades. How else to explain the quashed MCA investigations, the sealed court records in the Sam Israel case, and the bragging about tax evasion to a federal prosecutor's face? This was more than just some higher-up in the DOJ calling in a favor. Robert Booth Nichols appears to have been a member of some kind of special legal category which doesn't officially exist, where certain laws just don't apply. The stuff about Nichols belonging to a group called the Chosen Ones, who all wore matching skull and crossbones rings, sounds a little fantastical, but Nichols seemed to enjoy playing up this man of mystery angle about himself, even at the expense of the truth. Hence the associations with Bob Lazar and Ted Gunderson, the secret bond market, and the fakes at Bruder Film. The Octopus case is about many things, but the branch represented by Robert Booth Nichols is really the story of the privatization of the American intelligence apparatus and the impunity and lawlessness with which the power elite operate, both domestically and internationally. When figures at the top of the American military and intel agencies wanted to illegally sell weapons to the Iranians and the Contras, they just routed those arms sales through an Indian reservation, a money launderer, and a private intelligence firm created by FBI agents. When MCA wanted to launder money, manipulate its stock price, and do business with the mob, they just made a call to their good friend Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, and suddenly the prosecutors on the case were out of a job. And when their counterparts today want to illegally surveil Americans or sabotage the electoral prospects of right-wing parties in Europe, they just pass the job off to Palantir or Black Cube or any of the other private corporations which can carry out the national security state's most criminal and anti-democratic objectives with no oversight from Congress or anyone else. The federal prosecutor Richard Staven said that when his department was investigating Nichols, they suspected they were onto another Ollie North Iran-Contra deal, meaning a scandal just as big and explosive as Iran-Contra. But the whole reason Iran-Contra was a scandal in the first place was that elements within the military, intelligence, and quasi-private government contractors had been conducting their own shadow foreign policy in contravention of American laws and congressional oversight. Looking back, it seems almost quaint that congressmen actually expected the American intel agencies and military to follow laws and submit to civilian control. Because today, it can be revealed that the Pentagon and CIA were backing opposing sides in a war, or fighting on the side of Al-Qaeda, and it barely even registers as a scandal. The kinds of abuses which required a criminal conspiracy during the Reagan administration are now regularly committed out in the open, and then bragged about during investor meetings, or from the stage at Davos. And that's the primary irony of the Octopus case. Rather than becoming a unique historical outrage, the Octopus of the 80s and 90s proved to be a mere preview of the entrenched corruption and lawlessness, which are now just the way the government does business in 21st century America. In this sense, just like John Philip Nichols was a pioneer in the field of tribal sovereignty and Indian casinos, Robert Booth Nichols was something of a test case for a new age of government contractor profiteering, exploding black budgets, and de facto legal immunity for the corporate oligarchy which we're now living under. So ultimately, the Octopus is less a mystery to be solved than it is just a reality to be observed. And even if Robert Booth Nichols the man may be gone, the system he helped create is still going strong.